Alizeh stitched in the kitchen by the light of star and fire, sitting as she often did, curled up inside the hearth. Soot stained her skin and skirts in haphazard streaks, smudges along the crest of a cheek, a dusting of yet more darkness above one eye. She didn't seem to notice. Alizeh was cold. No, she was freezing. She often wished she were a body with hinges, that she might throw open a door in her chest and fill its cavity with coal, then kerosene, strike a match. Alas! She tugged up her skirts and shifted nearer the fire, careful lest she destroy the garment she still owed the illegitimate daughter of the Lausanne ambassador. The intricate, glittering piece was her only order this month, but Alizeh nursed a secret hope that the gown would conjure clients on its own, for such fashionable commissions were, after all, the direct result of an envy born only in a ballroom around a dinner table. So long as the kingdom remained at peace, the royal elite, legitimate and illegitimate alike, would continue to host parties and incur debt, which meant Alizeh might yet find ways to extract coin from their embroidered pockets. She shivered violently then, nearly missing a stitch, nearly toppling into the fire. As a toddling child, Alizeh had once been so desperately cold she'd crawled onto the searing hearth on purpose. Of course it had never occurred to her that she might be consumed by the blaze. She'd been but a babe following an instinct to seek warmth. Alizeh couldn't have known then the singularity of her affliction, for so rare was the frost that grew inside her body that she stood in stark relief even among her own people, who were thought to be strange indeed. A miracle, then, that the fire had only disintegrated her clothes and clogged the small house with a smoke that singed her eyes. A subsequent scream, however, signalled to the snug tot that her scheme was at an end. Frustrated by a body that would not warm, she'd wept frigid tears as she was collected from the flames, her mother sustaining terrible burns in the process, the scars of which Alizeh would study for years to come. "Her eyes!" the trembling woman had cried to her husband, who'd come running at the sounds of distress. "See what's happened to her eyes! They will kill her for this." Alizeh rubbed her eyes now and coughed. Surely she'd been too young to remember the precise words her parents had spoken. No doubt Alizeh's was a memory merely of a story oft repeated, one so thoroughly worn into her mind she only imagined she could recall her mother's voice. She swallowed. Soot had stuck in her throat. Her fingers had gone numb. Exhausted, she exhaled her worries into the hearth, the action disturbing to life another flurry of soot. Alizeh coughed for the second time then, this time so hard she stabbed the stitching needle into her small finger. She absorbed the shock of pain with preternatural calm, carefully dislodging the bit before inspecting the injury. The puncture was deep. Slowly, almost one at a time, her fingers closed around the gown still clutched in her hand, the finest silk stanching the trickle of her blood. After a few moments, during which she stared blankly up into the chimney for the 16th time that night, she released the gown, cut the thread with her teeth, and tossed the gem-encrusted novelty onto a nearby chair. Never fear. Alizeh knew her blood would not stain. Still, it was a good excuse to cede defeat, to set aside the gown. She appraised it now, sprawled as it was across the seat. The bodice had collapsed, bowing over the skirt much like a child might slump in a chair. Silk pooled around the wooden legs, beadwork catching the light. A weak breeze rattled a poorly latched window, and a single candle blew out, taking with it the remaining composure of the commission. The gown slid farther down the chair, one heavy sleeve releasing itself with a hush, its glittering cuff grazing the sooty floor. Alizeh sighed. This gown, like all the others, was far from beautiful. She thought the design trite, the construction only passably good. She dreamed of unleashing her mind, of freeing her hands to create without hesitation. But the roar of Alizeh's imagination was quieted, always, by an unfortunate need for self-preservation. It was only during her grandmother's lifetime that the fire accords had been established, unprecedented peace agreements that allowed Jinn and humans to mix freely for the first time in nearly a millennia. Though superficially identical, Jinn bodies had been forged from the essence of fire, imbuing in them certain physical advantages, while humans, whose beginnings were established in dirt and water, had long been labelled clay. Jinn had conceded to the establishment of the accords with a variegated relief, for the two races had been locked in bloodshed for eons, and though the enmity between them remained unresolved, all had tired of death. The streets had been gilded with liquid sun to usher in the era of this tenuous peacetime, the Empire's flag and coin reimagined in triumph. Every royal article was stamped with the maxim of a new age. Meras. May equality reign always supreme. Equality, as it turned out, had meant Jinn were to lower themselves to the weakness of humans, denying at all times the inherent powers of their race, the speed and strength and elective evanescence born unto their bodies. They were to cease at once what the king had declared such supernatural operations, or face certain death, and clay, who had exposed themselves as an insecure sort of creature, were only too willing to cry cheat, no matter the context. Alizeh could still hear the screams, the riots in the streets. She stared now at the mediocre gown. Always she struggled not to design an article too exquisite, for extraordinary work came under harsher scrutiny, and was only too quickly denounced as the result of a preternatural trick. Only once, having grown increasingly desperate to earn a decent living, had Alizeh thought to impress a customer not with style, but with craftsmanship. Not only was the quality of her work many orders of magnitude higher than that of the local modiste, but Alizeh could fashion an elegant morning gown in a quarter of the time, and had been willing to charge half as much. The oversight had sent her to the gallows. It had not been the happy customer, but the rival dressmaker who'd reported Alizeh to the magistrates. Miracle of miracles, she'd managed to evade their attempt to drag her away in the night, and fled the familiar countryside of her childhood for the anonymity of the city, hoping to be lost among the masses. Would that she might slough off the burdens she carried with her always, but Alizeh knew an abundance of reasons to keep to the shadows, chief among them the reminder that her parents had forfeited their lives in the interest of her quiet survival, and to comport herself carelessly now would be to dishonour their efforts. No, Alizeh had learned the hard way to relinquish her commissions long before she grew to love them. She stood, and a cloud of soot stood with her, billowing around her skirts. She'd need to clean the kitchen hearth before Mrs. Amina came down in the morning, or she'd likely be out on the street again. Despite her best efforts, Alizeh had been turned out onto the street more times than she could count. She'd always supposed it took little encouragement to dispose of that which was already seen as disposable, but these thoughts had done little to calm her. Alizeh collected a broom, flinching a little as the fire died. It was late, very late. The steady tick-tick of the clock wound something in her heart, made her anxious. Alizeh had a natural aversion to the dark, a rooted fear she could not fully articulate. She'd have rather worked a needle and thread by the light of the sun, but she spent her days doing the work that really mattered, scrubbing the rooms and latrines of Ba's house, the grand estate of Her Grace, the Duchess, Jamila of Fetrus. Alizeh had never met the Duchess, only seen the glittering older woman from afar. Alizeh's meetings were with Mrs. Amina, the housekeeper, who'd hired Alizeh on a trial basis only, as she'd arrived with no references. As a result, Alizeh was not yet permitted to interact with the other servants, nor was she allotted a proper room in the servants' wing. Instead, she'd been given a rotting closet in the attic, wherein she'd discovered a cot, its moth-eaten mattress, and half a candle. Alizeh had lain awake in her narrow bed that first night, so overcome she could hardly breathe. She minded neither the rotting attic nor its moth-eaten mattress, for Alizeh knew herself to be in possession of great fortune. That any grand house was willing to employ a Jinn was shocking enough, but that she'd been given a room, a respite from the winter streets. True, Alizeh had found stretches of work since her parents' deaths, and often she'd been granted leave to sleep indoors or in the hayloft. But never had she been given a space of her own. This was the first time in years she had privacy, a door she might close, and Alizeh had felt so thoroughly saturated with happiness she feared she might sink through the floor. Her body shook as she stared up at the wooden beams that night, at the thicket of cobwebs that crowded her head. A large spider had unspooled a length of thread, lowering itself to look her in the eye, and Alizeh had only smiled, clutching a skin of water to her chest. The water had been her single request. "A skin of water?" Mrs. Amina had frowned at her, frowned as if she'd asked to eat the woman's child. "You can fetch your own water, girl." "Forgive me, I would," Alizeh had said, eyes on her shoes, on the torn leather around the toe she'd not yet mended. "But I'm still new to the city, and I've found it difficult to access fresh water so far from home. There's no reliable cistern nearby, and I cannot yet afford the glass water in the market." Mrs. Amina roared with laughter. Alizeh went silent, heat rising up her neck. She did not know why the woman laughed at her. "Can you read, child?" Alizeh looked up without meaning to, registering the familiar fearful gasp before she'd even locked eyes with the woman. Mrs. Amina stepped back, lost her smile. "Yes," said Alizeh. "I can read." "Then you must try to forget." Alizeh started. "I beg your pardon?" "Don't be daft." Mrs. Amina's eyes narrowed. "No one wants a servant who can read. You ruin your own prospects with that tongue. Where did you say you were from?" Alizeh had frozen solid. She couldn't tell whether this woman was being cruel or kind. It was the first time anyone had suggested her intelligence might present a problem to the position, and Alizeh wondered then whether it wasn't true. Perhaps it had been her head, too full as it was, that kept landing her in the street. Perhaps, if she was careful, she might finally manage to keep a position for longer than a few weeks. No doubt she could feign stupidity in exchange for safety. "I'm from the north, ma'am," she'd said quietly. "Your accent isn't northern." Alizeh nearly admitted aloud that she'd been raised in relative isolation, that she'd learned to speak as her tutors had taught her, but then she remembered herself, remembered her station, and said nothing. "As I suspected," Mrs. Amina had said into the silence. "Rid yourself of that ridiculous accent. You sound like an idiot, pretending to be some kind of toff. Better yet, Say nothing at all. If you can manage that, you may prove useful to me. I've heard your kind don't tire out so easily, and I expect your work to satisfy such rumours, else I'll not scruple to toss you back into the street. Have I made myself clear?"
"Yes, ma'am."
"You may have your skin of water."
"Thank you, ma'am."
Alizeh curtsied, turned to go. "Oh, and one more thing." Alizeh turned back.
"Yes, ma'am."
"Get yourself a snudder as soon as possible. I never want to see your face again." 2. Alizeh had only just pulled open the door to her closet when she felt it. Felt him, as if she'd pushed her arms through the sleeves of a winter coat. She hesitated, heart pounding, and stood framed in the doorway. Foolish. Alizeh shook her head to clear it. She was imagining things, and no surprise, she was in desperate need of sleep. After sweeping the hearth, she'd had to scrub clean her sooty hands and face, too, and it had all taken much longer than she'd hoped. Her weary mind could hardly be held responsible for its delirious thoughts at this hour. With a sigh, Alizeh dipped a single foot into the inky depths of her room, feeling blindly for the match and candle she kept always near the door. Mrs. Amina had not allowed Alizeh a second taper to carry upstairs in the evenings, for she could neither fathom the indulgence nor the possibility that the girl might still be working long after the gas lamps had been extinguished. Even so, the housekeeper's lack of imagination did nothing to alter the facts as they were. This high up in so large an estate, it was near impossible for distant light to penetrate. Save the occasional slant of the moon through a mingy corridor window, the attic presented opaque in the night, black as tar. Were it not for the glimmer of the night sky to help her navigate the many flights to her closet, Alizeh might not have found her way, for she experienced a fear so paralyzing in the company of perfect darkness that when faced with such a fate, she held an illogical preference for death. Her single candle quickly found, the sought-after match was promptly struck, a tear of air, and the wick lit. A warm glow illuminated a sphere in the centre of her room, and for the first time that day, Alizeh relaxed. Quietly she closed the closet door behind her, stepping fully into a room hardly big enough to hold her cot. Just so. She loved it. She'd scrubbed the filthy closet until her knuckles had bled, until her knees had throbbed. In these ancient, beautiful estates, most everything was once built to perfection, and buried under layers of mould, cobwebs, and caked-on grime, Alizeh had discovered elegant herringbone floors, solid wood beams in the ceiling. When she'd finished with it, the room positively gleamed. Mrs. Amina had not, naturally, been to visit the old storage closet since it had been handed over to the help, but Alizeh often wondered what the housekeeper might say if she saw the space now, for the room was unrecognizable. But then, Alizeh had long ago learned to be resourceful. She removed her snudder, unwinding the delicate sheet of tulle from around her eyes. The silk was required of all those who worked in service, the mask marking its wearer as a member of the lower classes. The textile was designed for hard work, woven loosely enough to blur her features without obscuring necessary vision. Alizeh had chosen this profession with great forethought and clung every day to the anonymity her position provided, rarely removing her snudder even outside of her room, for though most people did not understand the strangeness they saw in her eyes, she feared that one day the wrong person might. She breathed deeply now, pressing the tips of her fingers against her cheeks and temples, gently massaging the face she'd not seen in what felt like years. Alizeh did not own a looking-glass, and her occasional glances at the mirrors in Ba's house revealed only the bottom third of her face, lips, chin, the column of her neck. She was otherwise a faceless servant, one of dozens, and had only vague memories of what she looked like, or what she'd once been told she looked like. It was the whisper of her mother's voice in her ear, the feel of her father's calloused hand against her cheek. "You are the finest of us all," he'd once said. Alizeh closed her mind to the memory as she took off her shoes, set the boots in their corner. Over the years, Alizeh had collected enough scraps from old commissions to stitch herself the quilt and matching pillow currently laid atop her mattress. Her clothes she hung from old nails, wrapped meticulously in colourful thread. All other personal effects she'd arranged inside an apple crate she'd found discarded in one of the chicken coops. She rolled off her stockings now and hung them, to air them out, from a taut bit of twine. Her dress went to one of the colourful hooks, her corset to another, her snudder to the last. Everything Alizeh owned, everything she touched, was clean and orderly, for she had learned long ago that when a home was not found, it was forged. Indeed, it could be fashioned even from nothing. Clad only in her shift, she yawned as she sat on her cot, as the mattress sank, as she pulled the pins from her hair. The day and her long heavy curls crashed down around her shoulders. Her thoughts had begun to slur. With great reluctance, she blew out the candle, pulled her legs against her chest, and fell over like a poorly weighted insect. The illogic of her phobia was consistent only in perplexing her, for when she was abed and her eyes closed, Alizeh imagined she could more easily conquer the dark, and even as she trembled with a familiar chill, she succumbed quickly to sleep. She reached for her soft quilt and drew it up over her shoulders, trying not to think about how cold she was, trying not to think at all. In fact, she shivered so violently, she hardly noticed when he sat down, his weight depressing the mattress at the foot of her bed. Alizeh bit back a scream. Her eyes flew open, tired pupils fighting to widen their aperture. Frantically, Alizeh patted down her quilt, her pillow, her threadbare mattress. There was no body on her bed, no one in her room. Had she been hallucinating? She fumbled for her candle and dropped it, her hands shaking. Surely she'd been dreaming. The mattress groaned, the weight shifting, and Alizeh experienced a fear so violent she saw sparks. She pushed backward, knocking her head against the wall, and somehow the pain focused her panic. A sharp snap, and a flame caught between his barely there fingers, illuminated the contours of his face. Alizeh dared not breathe. Even in silhouette she couldn't see him, not properly. But then, it was not his face, but his voice, that had made the devil notorious. Alizeh knew this better than most. Seldom did the devil present himself in some approximation of flesh. Rare were his clear and memorable communications. Indeed, the creature was not as powerful as his legacy insisted, for he'd been denied the right to speak as another might, doomed forever to hold forth in riddles, and allowed permission only to persuade a person to ruin, never to command. It was not usual, then, for one to claim an acquaintance with the devil, nor was it with any conviction that a person might speak of his methods, for the presence of such evil was experienced most often only through a provoking of sensation. Alizeh did not like to be the exception. Indeed, it was with some pain that she acknowledged the circumstances of her birth, that it had been the devil to first offer congratulations at her cradle, his unwelcome ciphers as inescapable as the wet of rain. Alizeh's parents had tried desperately to banish such a beast from their home, But he had returned again and again, forever embroidering the tapestry of her life with ominous forebodings, in what seemed a promise of destruction she could not outmaneuver. Even now, she felt the devil's voice, felt it like a breath loosed inside her body, an exhale against her bones.
"There once was a man,"
he whispered. "No!" she nearly shouted, panicking. "Not another riddle, please!"
"There once was a man,"
he whispered,
"who bore a snake on each shoulder."
Alizeh clapped both hands over her ears and shook her head. She'd never wanted so badly to cry. "Please," she said. "Please don't."
Again. "There once was a man who bore a snake on each shoulder. If the snakes were well fed, their master ceased growing older."
Alizeh squeezed her eyes shut, pulled her knees to her chest. He wouldn't stop. She couldn't shut him out.
"What they ate no one knew, even as the children."
"Please," she said, begging now. "Please, I don't want to know."
"What they ate no one knew, even as the children were found with brains shucked from their skulls, bodies splayed on the ground."
She inhaled sharply, and he was gone. Gone, the devil's voice torn free from her bones. The room suddenly shuddered around her, shadows lifting and stretching, and in the warped light a strange hazy face peered back at her. Alizeh bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. It was a young man staring at her now, one she did not recognize. That he was human, Alizeh had no doubt, but something about him seemed different from the others. In the dim light, the young man seemed carved not from clay, but marble, his face trapped in hard lines, centered by a soft mouth. The longer she stared at him, the harder her heart raced. Was this the man with the snakes? Why did it even matter? Why would she ever believe a single word spoken by the devil? Ah, but she already knew the answer to the latter. Alizeh was losing her calm. Her mind screamed at her to look away from the conjured face, screamed that this was all madness. And yet, heat crept up her neck. Alizeh was unaccustomed to staring too long at any face, and this one was violently handsome. He had noble features, all straight lines and hollows, easy arrogance at rest. He tilted his head as he took her in, unflinching as he studied her eyes. All his unwavering attention stoked a forgotten flame inside her, startling her tired mind. And then a hand, his hand, conjured from a curl of darkness. He was looking straight into her eyes when he dragged a vanishing finger across her lips. She screamed. In the beginning. The story of the devil had worn thin in the retelling, but Iblis, his true name like a heartbeat on the tongue, was lost to the catacombs of history. His own people knew best that the beast was wrought not from light, but fire, not angel, but Jinn, an ancient race who'd once owned the earth, who'd once celebrated this young man's extraordinary elevation to the heavens. They knew best whence he came, because they were there when he was returned, when his body cracked against the earth, and their world was left to rot in the wake of his arrogance. Birds froze when his body fell out of the sky, their sharp beaks parted, broad wings pinned open in mid-air. He glistened in his descent, flesh slick with fresh melt, heavy drops of liquid fire rolling off his skin. His drippings, still steaming, would hit the earth before his heft would, disintegrating frogs and trees and the shared dignity of an entire civilization who would be forced forever to scream his name at the stars. For when Iblis fell, so too did his people. It was not God, but the occupants of the expanding universe that would soon forsake the Jinn. Every celestial body had borne witness to the genesis of the devil, to a creature of darkness heretofore unknown, unnamed, and none wished to be seen as sympathetic to an enemy of the all-powerful. The sun was the first to turn its back on them. A single wink, and it was done. Their planet Earth was plunged into perpetual night, armored in ice, flung out of orbit. The moon faded next, knocking the world off its axis, warping its oceans. All was soon flooded, then frozen. The population neatly halved in 3 days. Thousands of years of history, of art and literature and invention, obliterated. Still, the surviving Jinn dared to hope. It was when the stars finally devoured themselves, one by one, when land sank and fissured underfoot, when maps of centuries past were suddenly rendered obsolete. It was when they could no longer find their way in the perpetual dark that the Jinn felt truly, irrevocably lost. They soon scattered. Iblis had been charged for his crime with a single task: to haunt forever the dirt forms that would soon crawl out of the earth. Clay, that crude, rudimentary form before which Iblis would not kneel, would inherit the world the Jinn had once owned. Of this, the Jinn were certain. It had been foretold. When? They did not know. The heavens observed the devil, the half-life he was forced to live. All watched silently as frozen seas overwhelmed the shores, tides rising parallel to his wrath. With every passing moment the darkness grew thicker, denser with the stench of death. Without the skies to guide them, the remaining Jinn could not determine how long their people spent compressed under cold and darkness. It felt like centuries, but might have been days. What was time when there were no moons to mind the hour, no suns to define a year? Time was told only through birth, through the children who lived. That their souls were forged from fire was the first of 2 reasons any Jinn had survived the infinite winters. The second, that they required only water for nourishment. Clay shaped itself slowly in such waters, shuddering into a finished form, while another civilization died, en masse, of heartbreak, of horror. The Jinn who endured against all odds were plagued always by a rage trapped in their chests, a rage held at bay only by the weight of an unyielding shame. Jinn were once the sole intelligent beings on Earth. They were creatures built stronger, faster, simpler, and more cunning than clay would ever be. Still, most had gone blind in the perpetual blackness. Their skin grew ashen, their irises white, stripped of pigment in the dark. In the torturous absence of the sun, even these fiery beings had grown weak, and when clay, freshly formed, finally stood tall on steady legs, the sun flared back to life, swinging their planet back into focus, and bringing with it a searing pain. Heat. It desiccated the Jinn's unaccustomed eyes, melted the remaining flesh from their bones. For the Jinn who'd sought shelter from this heat, there was hope. With the return of the sun came the moon, and with the moon, the stars. By starlight they navigated their way to safety, taking refuge at the apex of the earth, in a blistering cold that had begun to feel like home. Quietly they built a modest new kingdom, all the while pressing their supernatural bodies so hard against the planes of space and time as to practically disappear. It did not matter that Jinn were stronger than the clay bodies, human beings, they called themselves, that now owned the earth and its skies. It did not matter that Jinn possessed more power and strength and speed. It did not matter how hot their souls burned. Dirt, they had learned, would smother a flame. Dirt would eventually bury them all. And Iblis was never far. The devil's everlasting, shameful existence was a powerful reminder of all they'd lost, of all they'd endured to survive. With profound regret, Jinn surrendered the earth to its new kings and prayed never to be found. It was yet another prayer that went unanswered. 3. Alizeh shoved into the early morning light. She'd shoved out of bed, shoved on her clothes, shoved pins in her hair, shoved shoes on her feet. She usually took greater care with her toilette, but she'd slept later than she'd intended and had no time to do more than run a damp cloth over her eyes. The finished commission was due for delivery today, and she'd wrapped the glittering gown in layers of tulle, securing the package with twine. Alizeh handled the large parcel carefully as she tiptoed downstairs, and after building the fire in the kitchen hearth, pushed open the heavy wooden door, only to be met with fresh snowfall up to her knees. Alizeh's body nearly sagged with disappointment. She squeezed her eyes shut, took a steadying breath. No. She would not return to bed. It was true she did not yet own a proper winter coat, or hat, or even gloves. It was also true that if she raced back up the stairs this very instant, she might manage to sleep a full hour before she was needed. But no. She forced her spine straight, clutched the precious bundle to her chest. Today she would be getting paid. Alizeh stepped into the snow. The moon was so large this morning it blotted out most of the sky, its reflected light suffusing all in a dreamy glow. The sun was but a pinprick in the distance, its outline shining through a souffle of clouds. Trees stood tall and white, branches heavy with powder. It was early yet, snow still untouched along the paths, and the world shimmered, so white it looked almost blue. Blue snow, blue sky, blue moon. The air seemed even to smell blue, it was so cold. Alizeh huddled deeper into her thin jacket, listening as the wind tore through the streets. Ploughmen appeared as suddenly as if they'd been conjured by her thoughts, and she watched their choreographed movements, red trapper hats bobbing to and fro as shovels scraped to reveal stripes of gold cobblestone. Alizeh hurried herself onto a quickly clearing path and shook the snow from her clothes, stamped her feet against the glimmering stone. She was wet up to her thighs and did not want to think on it. Instead, she looked up. The day was not yet born, its sounds not yet formed. Street vendors had yet to set up their kiosks, shops had yet to unlatch their shuttered windows. Today a trio of bright green ducks waddled down the powdered median as wary shopkeepers peered out of doorways, poking broomsticks into the snow. A colossal white bear lounged on an icy corner, a street child sleeping soundly against its fur. Alizeh gave the bear a wide berth as she rounded the corner, her eyes following a spiral of smoke into the sky. Outdoor food carts were lighting their fires, preparing their wares. Alizeh inhaled the unfamiliar scents, testing them against her mind. She'd studied cookery, could identify eatables by sight, but she'd not had enough experience with food to be able to name things by smell. Jinn enjoyed food, but they did not need it, not the way most creatures did. As a result, Alizeh had foregone the decadence for several years. She used her income to pay instead for sewing supplies and regular baths at the local hammams. Her need for cleanliness grew parallel to her need for water. Fire was her soul, but water was her life. It was all she needed to survive. She drank it, bathed in it, required often to be near it. Cleanliness had as a result become a foundational principle of her life, one that had been hammered into her from childhood. Every few months she trekked deep into the forest to find a miswak tree, a toothbrush tree, from which she harvested the brush she used to keep her mouth fresh and her teeth white. Her line of work often left her filthy, and any truly idle time she had, she spent polishing herself to a shine. It was in fact her preoccupation with cleanliness that had led her to consider the benefits of such a profession. Alizeh stopped. She'd happened upon a shaft of sunlight and stood in it now, warming in the rays as a memory bloomed in her mind. A soapy bucket, the coarse bristles of a floor brush, her parents, laughing. The memory felt not unlike a handprint of heat against her sternum. Alizeh's mother and father had thought it critical to teach their child not only to care and clean for her own home, but to have basic knowledge of most all technical and mechanical labor. They'd wanted her to know the weight of a day's work. But then, they'd only meant to teach her a valuable lesson. They'd never meant for her to earn her living this way. While Alizeh had spent her younger years being honed by masters and tutors, so too had her parents humbled her in preparation for her imagined future, insisting always upon the greater good, the essential quality of compassion. "Feel," her parents had once said to her. "The shackles worn by your people are often unseen by the eye. Feel," they'd said, "for even blind, you will know how to break them." Would her mother and father laugh if they saw her now? Would they cry? Alizeh didn't mind working in service. She'd never minded hard work. But she knew she was likely a disappointment to her parents, even if only to their memories. Her smile faltered. The boy was fast, and Alizeh had been distracted, so it took her a second longer than usual to notice him, which meant she hadn't noticed him at all until the knife was at her throat. "Le man est parcelle," he said, his breath hot and sour against her face. He spoke Feshtun, which meant he was far from home and probably hungry. He towered over her from behind, his free hand roughly gripping her waist. By all appearances she was being assaulted by a barbarian, and yet somehow she knew he was just a boy, one overgrown for his age. Gently she said, "Unhand me. Do it now, and I give you my word I will leave you unharmed." He laughed. "Nezbeshof, stupid woman." Alizeh tucked the parcel under her left arm and snapped his wrist with her right hand, feeling the blade graze her throat as he screamed, stumbling back. She caught him before he fell, caught his arm and twisted it, dislocating his shoulder before pushing him into the snow. She stood over him as he sobbed, half buried in the drift. Passers-by were averting their eyes, uninvested as she knew they would be in the lower rungs of the world. A servant and a street urchin could be counted upon to do away with each other, save the magistrates the extra work. It was a grim thought. Carefully, Alizeh retrieved the boy's blade from the snow, examined its crude workmanship. She appraised the boy, too. His face was nearly as young as she'd suspected. 12? 13? She knelt beside him and he stiffened, his sobs briefly ceasing in his chest. Neck, neck, Lotfi, Lotfi. No, no, please, please. She took his unbroken hand in her own, uncurled the dirty fingers, pressed the hilt back into his palm. She knew the poor boy would need it. Still, there are other ways to stay alive, she whispered in Feshtun. Come to the kitchens at Ba's house if you are in need of bread. The boy stared at her then, turned the full force of his terrified gaze upon her. She could see him searching for her eyes through her snodder. Shura, he said. Why? Alizeh almost smiled. Bek mefem, she said quietly. Because I understand. Bek bidem, because I've been you. Alizeh did not wait for him to respond before she pushed herself to her feet, shook out her skirts. She felt a bit of moisture at her throat and retrieved a handkerchief from her pocket, which she pressed to the wound. She was still standing, unmoving, when the bell tolled, signalling the hour and startling into flight a constellation of starlings, their iridescent plumage glittering in the light. Alizeh breathed deep, pulling the cold air into her lungs. She hated the cold, but the chill was bracing at least, and the perpetual discomfort kept her awake better than any cup of tea had done. Alizeh had slept maybe 2 hours the night prior, but she could not allow herself to dwell on the deficit. She was expected to start work for Mrs. Amina in precisely 1 hour, which meant she'd have to accomplish a great deal in the next 60 minutes. Even so, she hesitated. The knife at her throat had discomposed her. It was not the aggression she found unnerving. In her time on the streets, she'd dispatched far worse than a hungry boy wielding a knife. It was the timing. She'd not forgotten the events of last night, the devil's voice, the young man's face. She'd not forgotten. She'd simply set it aside. Worrying was its own occupation. For Alizeh, a third occupation. It was a job that required of her the free time she seldom possessed, so she often shelved her distress, leaving it to collect dust until she found a moment to spare. Still, Alizeh was no fool. Iblis had been haunting her all her life, had driven her near to madness with his indecipherable riddles. She'd never been able to fathom his abiding interest in her, for though she knew the frost in her veins made her unusual even among her own people, it seemed an insufficient reason to recommend the girl for all this torture. Alizeh hated how her life had been platted with the whispers of such a beast. The devil was universally reviled by Jinn and clay, but it had taken humans millennia to discern this truth, that Jinn hated the devil perhaps more than anyone else. Iblis was responsible, after all, for the downfall of their civilization, for the lightless, unforgiving existence to which Alizeh's ancestors had long been sentenced. Jinn suffered dearly as a result of Iblis's actions, his arrogance, at the hands of humans who for thousands of years considered it their divine duty to expunge the earth of such beings, beings seen only as descendants of the devil. The stain of this hatred was not so easily lifted. One certainty at least had been proven to Alizeh over and over. The devil's presence in her life was an omen, a portending of imminent misery. She'd heard his voice before every death, every sorrow, before every inflamed joint upon which her rheumatic life turned. Only when she was feeling particularly soft of heart did she acknowledge a nagging suspicion that the devil's missives were in fact a perverse sort of kindness, as if he thought he might blunt an inevitable pain with a warning. Instead, the dread often made it worse. Alizeh spent her days wondering what torture might befall her, what agony lay in wait. There was no telling how long it... Her hand froze, forgot itself. Her bloody handkerchief fluttered to the ground, unnoticed. Alizeh's heart suddenly pounded with the force of hooves beating against her chest. She could scarcely draw breath. That face, that inhuman face. Here! He was here! He was already watching her. She noticed his cloak at almost the same time she noticed his face. The superfine black wool was heavy, exquisitely crafted. She recognized its subtle grandeur even from here, even in this moment. It was, without question, the work of Madame Nesrine, the master seamstress of the Empire's most eminent atelier. Alizeh would recognize the woman's work anywhere. In point of fact, Alizeh would recognize the work of most any atelier in the Empire, which meant she often needed only a single look at a stranger to know how many people might pretend to mourn them at a funeral. This man, she decided, would be mourned by a great many sycophants, his pockets deeper, no doubt, than Dariush himself. The stranger was tall, forbidding. He'd drawn the hood over his head, casting most of his face in shadow, but he was far from the anonymous creature he hoped to be. In the wind, Alizeh glimpsed the lining of his cloak, the purest ink silk, aged in wine, cured with frost. Years it took to create such a textile, thousands of hours of labor. The young man likely had no idea what he wore, just as he seemed to have no idea that she could tell, even from here, that the clasp at his throat was pure gold, that the cost of his simple, unadorned boots would feed hundreds of families in the city. He was a fool to think he might disappear here, that he might have the advantage of her, that he might... Alizeh went deathly still. Understanding awoke slowly in her mind, and with it a thick, disorienting unease. How long had he been standing there? There once was a man who bore a snake on each shoulder. In truth, Alizeh might not have noticed him at all were he not looking directly at her, pinning her in the air with his eyes. It hit her then. She gasped. Hit her with the force of a thunderclap. She saw him now only because he allowed it. Who was the fool, then? She. Panic set fire to her chest. Alizeh tore herself from the ground and fairly disappeared, tearing off through the streets with the preternatural swiftness she usually saved for her worst altercations. Alizeh did not know what darkness this strange clay face would bring. She only knew she'd never be able to outrun it. Still, she had to try. 4. The moon sat so large in the sky, Kamran thought he might lift a finger to its skin, draw circles around its wounds. He stared at its veins and starbursts, white pockmarks, like spider sacks. He studied it all as his mind worked, his eyes narrowing in the aftermath of an impossible illusion. She'd fairly disappeared. He'd not meant to stare, but how, also, was he meant to look away? He'd seen danger in the assailant's movements even before the man drew his knife. Worse, no one paid the altercation any attention. The girl could have been maimed or abducted or murdered in the worst ways, and even though Kamran had been sworn to anonymity in daylight, his every instinct compelled him to issue a warning, to step in before it was too late. He needn't have worried. Still, there was much that troubled him, not the least of which was that there'd seemed something amiss about the girl. She'd worn a snodder, a sheath of semi-transparent silk, around her eyes and nose, which did not obscure exactly, but blur her features. The snodder itself was innocuous enough. It was required of all who worked in service. She was ostensibly a maid. But servants were not required to wear the snodder outside of work, and it was unusual that the girl had worn hers at this early hour when the royals were still abed. It seemed far more likely that she was not a maid at all. Spies had been infiltrating the empire of Ardunia for years, but these numbers had been bloating dangerously in more recent months, feeding an unnerving concern that lately crowned Kamran's thoughts, and which he could not now shake. He exhaled his frustration, shaping a cloud in the cold. More in every moment, Kamran grew convinced the girl had stolen the servant's uniform, for her covert attempt had not only been poorly executed, but easily betrayed by an ignorance of the many rules and mannerisms that defined the lives of the lower classes. Her gait alone would have been warning enough. She'd walked too well for a servant, carrying herself with a kind of regal bearing established only in infancy. No, Kamran felt certain now that the girl had been hiding something. It would not be the first time someone had used the snodder to mask themselves in public. Kamran glanced at the clock in the square. He'd come into town this morning to speak with the diviners, who'd sent a mysterious note requesting an audience with the young man, despite his never having announced his return home. Today's meeting, it seemed, would have to wait. For much to his dismay, Kamran's always reliable instincts would not quiet. How, with only one free hand, had a maid so coolly disarmed a man holding a knife to her throat? When would a maid have had the time or coin to spare learning self-defense? And what on earth had she said to the man to leave him weeping in the snow? The suspect in question was only now stumbling to his feet. His shock of red curls screamed he was from Fesht, a region at least 1 month south of Setar, the capital city. Not only was the assailant far from home, but he appeared to be in severe pain, one arm hanging lower than the other. Kamran watched as the redhead held his bad limb, dislocated it seemed, with the good, carefully steadying himself. Tears had tracked clean paths down his otherwise dirty cheeks, and for the first time, Kamran got a good look at the criminal. Had he more practice with outward displays of emotion, Kamran's features might have registered surprise. The assailant was quite young. Kamran moved swiftly toward him, sliding a mask of intricate chain mail over his face as he went. He walked into the wind, his cloak snapping against his boots, and only when he'd all but collided with the child did he stop. It was enough that the Fesht boy jumped back at his approach, wincing as the movement jostled his injury. The boy cradled his wounded arm and curled inward, head to his chest, like a humbled millipede, and with an unintelligible murmur tried to pass. "Lotfi hej besht. Please, sir, excuse me." The gall of this child! Kamran could scarce believe it. Still, it was a comfort to know that he'd been correct. The boy spoke Feshtun and was far from home. Kamran had every intention of handing the child over to the magistrates. It had been his sole purpose in seeking out the boy. But now, unable to pry loose his suspicions, he found himself hesitating. Again the child tried to pass, and again Kamran blocked his path. "Kyatan gofta chiknez. What did the young woman say to you?" The boy startled, stepped back. His skin was a shade or two lighter than his brown eyes, with a smattering of darker freckles across his nose. Heat blossomed across his face in unflattering splotches. "Beshti hej nekmevem." "I'm sorry, sir. I don't understand." Kamran stepped closer. The boy nearly whimpered.
Jev man, he said. Press. Answer me. Now.
The boy's tongue came loose then, almost too quickly to be comprehensible. Kamran translated in his head as the child spoke. "Nothing, sir. Please, sir, I didn't hurt her. It was only a misunderstanding." Kamran clamped a gloved hand around the boy's dislocated shoulder, and the feshed boy cried out, gasping as his knees buckled.
"You dare lie to my face!"
"Sir, please!" The child was crying now. "She only gave me back my knife, sir, I swear it, and then she offered me bread. She said—"
Kamran rocked backward, dropping his hand. "You continue to lie."
"On my mother's grave, I swear, on all that is holy."
"She returned your weapon and offered to feed you," Kamran said sharply. "After you nearly killed her. After you tried to steal from her."
The boy shook his head, tears welling again in his eyes. "She showed me mercy, sir. Please."
"Enough!"
The boy's mouth snapped shut. Kamran's frustration was mounting. He wanted desperately to throttle someone. He searched the square once more, as if the girl might appear as easily as she'd evaporated. His gaze landed again on the boy. It was like thunder, his voice.
"You pressed a blade to a woman's throat? Like the worst coward, the most detestable of men. That young woman might have shown you mercy, but I see no reason to do the same. You expect to walk away from this without judgment? Without justice?"
The boy panicked. "Please, sir, I will go and die, sir. I will slit my own throat if you ask me to. Only don't hand me over to the magistrates, I beg you." Kamran blinked. The situation grew more complicated by the second.
"Why do you say such a thing?"
The boy shook his head then, growing only more hysterical. His eyes were wild, his fear too palpable for theatre. Soon he began to wail, the sound ringing through the streets. Kamran did not know how to calm the urchin. His own dying soldiers had never allowed themselves such weakness in his presence. Too late, Kamran considered letting the boy go, but he'd hardly begun to formulate the thought when, without warning, the child drove the length of the crude blade into his own throat. Kamran inhaled sharply. The boy, whose name he did not know, choked on his own blood, on the knife still buried in his neck. Kamran caught him when he fell, could feel the outline of the boy's ribs under his fingers. He was light as a bird, bones hollowed out, no doubt, by hunger. Old impulses prevailed. Kamran issued commands to passers-by with the voice he used to lead a legion, and strangers appeared as if out of thin air, abandoning their own children to carry out his orders. His head was so dense with disbelief, he hardly noticed when the boy was lifted from his arms and carried out of the square. The way he stared at the blood, the spotted snow, the red rivulets circling a manhole cover, it was as if Kamran had never seen death, hadn't seen it 1,000 times over. He had. He thought he'd seen all manner of darkness. But Kamran had never before witnessed a child commit suicide. It was then that he saw the handkerchief. He'd watched the young woman press it to her throat, to the wound inflicted by a boy who was now presumably dead. He'd watched this strange girl manage her own near death with the forbearance of a soldier, meting out justice with the compassion of a saint. He held no doubt now that she was indeed a spy, one in possession of an astuteness of mind that surprised him. She'd known in but a moment how to handle the child, had she not? She'd done far better than he, had judged better, and now, as he processed her earlier escape, his fears only ratcheted higher. It was rare that Kamran experienced shame, but the sensation roared inside him now, refusing to be quieted. With a single finger, He lifted the embroidered square out of the snow. He had expected the white textile to be stained with blood. It was pristine. 5. Kamran's heels knocked against the marble floors with unusual force, the sounds echoing through the cavernous halls of his home. Upon his father's death, Kamran had discovered that he could be propelled through life by a single emotion. Carefully cultivated, it grew hot and vital inside his chest, like an experimental organ. Anger. It kept him alive better than his heart ever had. He felt anger always, but he felt it especially now, and Lord save the man who crossed him when he was at his worst. After tucking the girl's handkerchief into his breast pocket, he'd pivoted sharply, single-minded as he strode toward his horse, the animal patiently awaiting his return. Kamran liked horses. They did not ask questions before doing as they were told, at least not with their tongues. The jet stallion had not minded his master's bloodied cloak, nor his distracted temper. Not the way Hassan did. The minister trailed him now with impressive speed, his the second set of boots pounding the stone floors. Had they not grown up together, Kamran might have reacted to this insolence with an inelegant method of problem-solving, brute force. But then it was his incapacity for awe that made Hassan perfect for his role as minister. Kamran could not countenance sycophants. "You are worse than an idiot. Did you know?" Hassan said with great serenity. "You should be nailed to the oldest benzes tree. I should let the scarabs strip the flesh from your bones." Kamran said nothing. "It could take weeks." Hassan had caught up, and now he kept pace easily. "I would watch, happily, as they devoured your eyes." "Surely you exaggerate." "I assure you, I do not." Without warning, Kamran stopped walking. Hassan, to his credit, did not falter. The two young men turned sharply to face each other. Hassan had once been the kind of boy whose knees resembled arthritic knuckles. As a child, he could hardly stand up straight to save his life. Kamran could not help but marvel at the difference in him now, at the boy who'd grown into the kind of man who felt comfortable threatening to murder the crown prince with a smile. It was with a begrudging respect that Kamran met his minister's eyes. They were nearly the same height, he and Hassan, similar builds, wildly different features. "No," Kamran said, sounding tired even to himself. The sharp edge of his anger had begun to fade. "As to your enthusiasm for my brutal death, I have no doubt. I refer only to your assessment of the damage you claim I've done." Hassan's hazel eyes flashed at that, the only outward sign of his frustration. Still, he spoke calmly when he said, "That there lingers any uncertainty in your mind that you've not committed a grievous error says only to me, sire, that you should have your neck checked by the palace butcher." Kamran almost smiled. "You think this is funny?" Hassan took a measured step closer. "You've only alerted the kingdom to your presence, only shouted into a crowd every proof of your identity, only marked yourself as a target while entirely unguarded." Kamran unlatched the clasp at his throat, stretched his neck, let the cloak drop. The article was caught by unseen hands, a spectre-like servant scraping in, then out of sight with the bloodied garment. In the fraction of a second he saw the blur of the servant's snudder, he was reminded again of the girl. Kamran dragged a hand down his face, with grim results. He'd forgotten about the boy's dried blood on his hands, and hoped he might forget again. In the interim, he only half listened to the minister's reprimands, with which he did not at all agree. The prince neither saw his actions as foolish, nor did he think it beyond him to be interested in the affairs of the lower classes. Privately, Kamran might allow an argument defending the futility of such an interest, for he knew if he were to concern himself with every violent attack on the city streets, he'd scarcely find time to breathe. But apart from the fact that an interest in the lives of the Ardunian people was entirely within the prince's purview, the morning's bloodletting had seemed to him more than a random act of violence. Indeed, the more he'd studied the situation, the more nefarious it had presented, its actors more complex than first appeared. It had seemed wise at the time to insert himself in the situation. A situation that concerned two worthless bodies better off extinguished by their own kind, Hassan said with little emotion. The girl had seen fit to let the boy go, as you claim, and yet you found her judgment wanting? You felt it necessary to play God? No, don't answer that. I don't think I want to know. Kamran only glanced at his minister. Hassan's lips pressed into a thin line. I might have been motivated to consider the wisdom of your intervention had the boy actually killed the girl. Barring that, he said flatly, I can see no excuse for your reckless behavior, sire. No explanation for your thoughtlessness, save a grotesque need to be a hero. Kamran looked up at the ceiling. He'd loved little in his life, but he'd always appreciated the comfort of symmetry, of sequences that made sense. He stared now at the soaring domed ceilings, the artistry of the alcoves carved into alcoves. Every expanse and cavity was adorned with starbursts of rare metals, glazed tiles expertly arranged into geometric patterns that repeated ad infinitum. He lifted a bloody hand, and Hassan fell silent. Enough, Kamran said quietly. I've indulged your censure long enough. Yes, Your Highness. Hassan took a step back, but stared curiously at the prince. More than usual, I'd say. Kamran forced a sardonic smile. I beg you to spare me your analysis. I would dare to remind you, sire, that it is my imperial duty to provide you the very analysis you detest. A regrettable fact. And a loathsome occupation, is it not, when one's counsel is thusly received? A bit of advice, Minister. When offering counsel to a barbarian, you might consider first lowering your expectations. Hassan smiled. You are not at all yourself today, sire. Chipper than usual, am I? Your mood is a great deal darker this morning than you would care to admit. Just now I might inquire as to why the death of a street child has you so overwrought. You would be wasting your breath in the effort. Ah? Hassan still held his smile. I see the day is not yet ripe enough for honesty. If I am indeed overwrought, said the prince, losing a modicum of composure, it is no doubt a symptom of my enthusiasm to remind you that my father would have had you hung for your insolence. Just so, Hassan said softly, though it occurs to me now that you are not your father. Kamran's head snapped up. He drew his sword from its scabbard without thinking, and not until he saw the barely contained mirth in his minister's eyes did he stall, his hand frozen on the hilt. Kamran was rattled. He'd been gone from home for over a year. He'd forgotten how to have normal conversations. Long months he'd spent in the service of the Empire, securing borders, leading skirmishes, dreaming of death. Ardunia's rivalry with the South was as old as time. Ardunia was a formidable empire, the largest in the known world, and their greatest weakness was both a well-kept secret and a source of immense shame. They were running out of water. Kamran was proud of Ardunia's existing Qanat systems, intuitive networks that transported water from aquifers to above-ground reservoirs, and upon which people relied for their drinking water and irrigation. The problem was that Qanats relied entirely upon the availability of groundwater, which meant large swaths of the Ardunian Empire were for centuries rendered uninhabitable, a problem mitigated only by barging fresh water via marine vessel from the Mashti River. The fastest path to this titanic waterway was located at the nadir of Tulan, a small neighbouring empire affixed to Ardunia's southernmost border. Tulan was much like a flea they could not shake free, a parasite that could neither be eliminated nor exhumed. Ardunia's greatest wish was to build an aqueduct straight through the heart of the southern nation, but decade after decade its kings would not bow. Tulan's only peaceful offering in exchange for such access was a punishing, ruinous tax, one too great even for Ardunia. Several times they tried simply to decimate Tulan, but the Ardunian military had suffered astonishing losses as a result. Kamran's own father had died in the effort, and none in the north could understand why. Hatred had grown between the two nations, not unlike an impassable mountain range. For nearly a century the Ardunian navy had been forced instead to take a far more dangerous route to water, travelling many months for access to the tempestuous river. It was lucky, then, that Ardunia had been blessed not only with a reliable rainy season, but with engineers who'd built impressive catchment areas to capture and store rainwater for years at a time. Even so, the clouds never seemed quite as full these days, and the Empire's cisterns were running low. Every day, Kamran prayed for rain. The Empire of Ardunia was not officially at war, not yet. But peace, too, Kamran had learned, was maintained at a bloody price. "Your Highness," Hazan's tentative voice startled the prince, returning him to the present moment. "Forgive me. I spoke thoughtlessly." Kamran looked up. The details of the hall in which he stood came suddenly into sharp focus. Glossy marble floors, towering jade columns, soaring opalescent ceilings. He felt the worn leather hilt of his sword against his palm, growing all the while incrementally aware of the musculature of his body, the dense weight he carried always and seldom considered, the heaviness in his arms, the heft of his legs. He forced himself to return the sword to its scabbard, briefly closing his eyes. He smelled rosewater and fresh rice. A servant bustled past, carrying a copper tray laden with tea things. How long had he been lost in his own thoughts? Kamran had grown anxious and distracted of late. The recent swell of Tulanian spies discovered on Ardunian land had done little for his sleep. Alone it would have been a disturbing enough discovery, but this intelligence was compounded by his own myriad worries, for not only did the prince fear for their reservoirs, but he'd seen things on his recent tour of duty that continued to unnerve him. The future seemed dim, and his role in it bleak. As was expected, the prince sent his grandfather frequent updates while away. His most recent letter had been rife with news of Tulan, whose small empire became only bolder as the days went on. Rumours of discord and political manoeuvring grew louder each day, and despite the tenuous peace between the two empires, Kamran suspected war might soon be inevitable. His return to the capital the week prior was for two reasons only. First, after completing a perilous water journey, He'd had to replenish the central cisterns that fed the others throughout the empire, and then deliver his troops safely home. Second, and more simply, his grandfather had asked it of him. In response to Kamran's many concerns, the prince had been instructed to return to Satar. For a respite, his grandfather had said. An innocuous enough request, one Kamran knew to be quite irregular. The prince had been restored to the palace for a week now, and every day he grew only more unsettled. Even after 7 days home, the king had yet to respond directly to his note, and Kamran had grown restless without a mission, without his soldiers. He was just then listening to Hassan articulate these same thoughts, allowing that this very restlessness was perhaps the only plausible explanation for your actions this morning. Yes, Kamran could at least agree that he was eager to return to work. He would need to leave again, he realized. Soon. I grow tired of this conversation, the prince said curtly. Do assist me in welcoming its swift conclusion and tell me what it is you require. I must be on my way. Hassan hesitated. Yes, sire, of course, but do you not wish to know what has become of the child? What child? The boy, of course, the one whose blood stains your hands even now. Kamran stiffened, his anger sparking suddenly back to life. It took little, he realized, to rekindle a fire that only dulled, but never died. I would not. But it might comfort you to know that he is not yet dead. Comfort me? You seem distressed, Your Highness, and I... Kamran took a step forward, his eyes flashing. He studied Hassan closely, the broken slope of his nose, his cropped, ash-blonde hair. Hassan's skin was so densely freckled, one could scarcely see his eyebrows. He'd been bullied mercilessly as a child for what seemed a myriad of reasons, tragic in all ways save one. It was Hassan's suffering that had conjured their first introduction. The day Kamran defended the illegitimate child of a courtier was the same day that knobby-kneed child pledged fealty to the young prince. Even then, Kamran had tried to look away. He'd tried valiantly to ignore the affairs deemed beneath him, but he could not manage it. He could not manage it still. You forget yourself, Minister, Kamran said softly. I would encourage you now to get to your point. Hassan bowed his head. Your grandfather is waiting to see you. You are expected in his rooms at once. Kamran briefly froze, his eyes closing. I see. You are not exaggerating your frustration, then? No, sire. Kamran opened his eyes. In the distance, a kaleidoscope of colours bedimmed, then brightened. Soft murmurs of conversation carried over to him, the gentle footfalls of scurrying servants, a blur of snodders. He'd never paid much attention to it, the centuries-old uniform. Now every time he saw one he would think of that accursed servant girl. Spy! He nearly snapped his neck just to clear the thought. What, pray, does the king want from me? Hassan prevaricated. Now that your people know you are home, I expect he will ask you to do your duty. Which is? To host a ball. Indeed. Kamran's jaw clenched. I'm certain I would rather set myself on fire. If that is all. He's quite serious, Your Highness. I've heard rumours that the announcement for a ball has already been... Good! You will take this. Kamran retrieved the handkerchief from his jacket, pinching it between thumb and forefinger, and have it examined. Hassan quickly pocketed the white handkerchief. Shall I have it examined for anything in particular, Your Highness? Blood. At Hassan's blank look, the prince went on.
It belonged to the servant girl whose neck was nearly slit by the Fesht boy. I think she might be Jinn." Now Hassan frowned. "I see. I fear you do not. Forgive me, Your Highness, but in what way does her blood concern us? As you know, the fire accords give Jinn the right to—" "I am well acquainted with our laws, Hassan. My concern is not merely with her blood, but with her character." Hassan raised his eyebrows. "I don't trust her," Kamran said sharply. "Need you trust her, sire?" "There's something false about the girl. She was too refined in her manners."
"Ah." Hassan's eyebrows lifted higher, comprehension dawning. "And in light of all our recent friendliness from Toulon—"
"I want to know who she is."
"You think her a spy?" It was the way he said it, as if he thought Kamran delusional, that soured the prince's expression.
"You did not see her the way I did, Hassan. She disarmed the boy in a single motion, dislocated his shoulder. You know as well as I do how the Tulanians covet the Jinn for their strength and fleet-footedness."
"Indeed," Hassan said carefully. "Though I should remind you, sire, that the child she disarmed was weak from hunger to the point of death. His bones might have been unhinged by a strong gust of wind. An ailing rat might have bested him."
"Just the same, you will have her found out."
"The servant girl."
"Yes, the servant girl," Kamran said irritably. "She fled the scene when she saw me. She looked at me as if she knew me."
"Forgive me, sire, but I thought you could not see her face?"
Kamran took a sharp breath. "Perhaps you will thank me, Minister, for employing you with such a task? Unless, of course, you would rather I seek your replacement."
Hassan's lips twitched. He bowed. "It is a pleasure, as always, to be at your service."
"You will tell the king I must bathe before our meeting."
"But, sire—" Kamran strode away, his retreating footfalls ringing out once more through the cavernous hall. His anger had again begun to percolate, bringing with it a humidity that seemed to fog his vision, dim the sounds around him. It was a shame, then, that Kamran did not dissect himself. He did not stare out of windows wondering what other emotions might be lurking beneath the veneer of his ever-present anger. It did not occur to him that he might be experiencing a muddied sort of grief. So it did not strike him as unusual that he was fantasizing just then about driving a sword through a man's heart. In fact, he was so consumed by his imaginings that he did not hear his mother calling his name, her bejeweled robes dragging, sapphires scoring the marble floors as she went. No, Kamran seldom heard his mother's voice until it was too late. 6. Alizeh's morning had been, among other things, disappointing. She'd sacrificed an hour of sleep, braved the winter dawn, narrowly escaped an attempt on her life, and eventually returned to Ba's house with only regret to report, wishing her pockets weighed as heavy as her mind. She'd carried the unwieldy parcel through several snowdrifts before arriving at the servants' entrance of the Lausanne ambassador's estate, and, after forcing her frozen lips to stammer out an explanation for her appearance at the threshold, the bespectacled housekeeper had handed Alizeh a purse with her pay. Alizeh, shivering and fatigued, had made the mistake of counting the coin only after relinquishing her commission, and then, forgetting herself entirely, dared to say aloud that she thought there'd been some kind of mistake. "Forgive me, ma'am, but this is only half of what we agreed upon."
The housekeeper sniffed. "You'll get the rest once my mistress decides she likes the dress.
Alizeh's eyes went round. Perhaps if her skirts hadn't been stiff with frost, or if her chest had not felt as if it might fissure from cold, perhaps if her lips had not been so very numb, or if her feet had not lost all sensation, perhaps then she might have remembered to bite her tongue. Instead, Alizeh managed only to contain the worst of her outrage. A miracle, really, that she spoke with some measure of equanimity when she said, "But Miss Huda might decide she doesn't like the dress, simply to avoid payment." The housekeeper recoiled, as if she'd been struck. "Careful what you say, girl. I won't hear anyone call my mistress dishonest." "But surely you can see that this is indeed Alizeh said, slipping on a spot of ice. She caught herself against the doorframe, and the housekeeper shrank back farther, this time with an undisguised revulsion. "Off!" the woman snapped. "Get your filthy hands off my door!" Startled, Alizeh jumped back, miraculously avoiding another patch of ice just 2 inches to her left. "Miss Huda won't even allow me in the house," she stammered, her body now trembling violently with cold. "She wouldn't allow me to do a single fitting. She could decide for any number of reasons that she doesn't like my work." The door slammed shut in her face. Alizeh had experienced a sharp pinch in her chest then, a pain that made it hard to breathe. The feeling had remained with her all day. She felt for the little purse now, its weight in her apron pocket, resting against her thigh. She'd been delayed getting back to Bar's house, which meant she'd had no time to deposit her earnings somewhere safer. The world had begun to come alive on her journey back, fresh snowfall dotting every effort to awaken the city of Sator. Preparations for the Windrose festival had overtaken the streets, and though Alizeh appreciated the heady scent of rosewater in the air, she would have preferred a moment of quiet before the bell tolled for work. She could not have known then that the quiet she sought might not come at all. Alizeh was in the kitchen when the clock struck 6, broomstick in hand, standing silently in the shadows and as near to the fire as she could manage. The other servants had gathered an hour earlier around the kitchen's long wooden table for their morning meal, and Alizeh watched, rapt, as they finished the last of their breakfast, bowls of halim, a kind of sweet porridge blended with shredded beef. As a trial employee, Alizeh was not yet allowed to join them, nor did she have any interest in their meal, the mere description of which made her stomach turn. But she enjoyed listening to their easy banter, witnessing the familiarity with which they spoke to one another. They engaged like friends or family. It was a kind of ordinariness with which Alizeh was little acquainted. Her parents' love for her had filled her whole life. Alizeh had wanted for little, and was denied in her childhood nothing but the company of other children. For her mother and father were adamant that until the moment Alizeh was ready, her existence remained otherwise undiscovered. Alizeh could recollect only one little boy, whose mother was a dear friend of her parents, with whom she was allowed on occasion to play. His name she could not now recall. She remembered only that his pockets were always full of hazelnuts, with which he taught her to play a game of jacks. Only a select few other trustworthy souls, mostly the masters and tutors with whom she spent a great deal of her time, had been allowed in her life. She had been, as a result, sheltered to an uncommon degree, and having spent little time in clay company, was now spellbound by a great many of their customs. Alizeh had been punished in her previous positions for lingering too long in a breakfast-room, for example, hoping for a glimpse of a gentleman eating an egg or buttering a slice of toast. She was endlessly fascinated by their forks and spoons, and this morning was no different. "What do you think you're doing here?" Mrs. Amina barked at her, startling Alizeh nearly to death. The housekeeper grabbed Alizeh by the scruff of her neck and shoved her into the adjoining hall. "You forget yourself, girl. You don't eat with the other servants." I was only waiting," Alizeh said, wincing as her fingers fluttered around her neck, gently pulling her collar back into place. The cut at her throat was still tender, and Alizeh had not wanted to draw attention to herself by wrapping it. She felt the telltale moisture of what could only be fresh blood, and clenched her fists to keep from touching the wound. "Forgive me, ma'am. I never meant to be impertinent. I was only awaiting your instruction." It happened so fast, Alizeh didn't even realize Mrs. Amina had slapped her until she felt the pain in her teeth, saw the flash of light behind her eyes. Too late, Alizeh flinched and shrank back, her ears ringing, hands grasping for purchase against the stone wall. She'd made too many mistakes today. "What did I tell you about that mouth of yours?" Mrs. Amina was saying. "You want this position. You will learn your place." She made a sound of disgust. "I told you to rid yourself of that absurd accent." "Impertinent," she scoffed. "Where you even learned to talk like that?" Alizeh felt the change when Mrs. Amina cut herself off, watched her eyes darken with suspicion. Alizeh swallowed. "Where did you learn to talk like that?" Mrs. Amina asked quietly. "Knowing your letters is one thing, but you begin to strike me as a bit too high in the instep for a scullery girl." "Not at all, ma'am," Alizeh said, lowering her eyes. She tasted blood in her mouth. Already her face was tender. She resisted the impulse to touch what was no doubt a purpling bruise. "I beg your pardon." "Who taught you to read, then?" Mrs. Amina rounded on her. "Who taught you to put on airs?" "Forgive me, ma'am." Alizeh flinched, forced herself to talk slowly. "I don't mean to put on airs, ma'am. It's only that I don't know how else to speak." Mrs. Amina looked up then, distracted by the sight of the clock, and the fight went out of her eyes. They'd lost precious minutes of the work-day already, and Alizeh knew they could not afford to lose more to this conversation. Still, Mrs. Amina stepped closer. "Speak to me like you're some fancy toff one more time, and not only will you see the back of my hand, girl, you'll be back on the street." Alizeh felt suddenly ill. If she closed her eyes, she could still feel the rough stone of the cold, vermin-infested alley pressed against her cheek. She could still hear the sounds of the sewer lulling her into unconsciousness for minutes at a time, the longest she'd ever dared to keep her eyes closed on the street. Alizeh sometimes thought she'd rather run in front of a carriage than return to such darkness. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly, her pulse racing. "Forgive me, ma'am. It won't happen again." "Enough of your pompous apologies," Mrs. Amina snapped. "Her ladyship is in a frightful state today and wants every room scrubbed and polished as if the king himself were coming to visit." Alizeh dared to look up. Ba's house had 7 floors and 116 individual rooms. Alizeh wanted more than anything to ask, "Why? Why every room?" Instead, she held her tongue, grieving quietly. Scrubbing all 116 in one day, she knew, would leave her body in ribbons. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered. Mrs. Amina hesitated. Alizeh could see then that Mrs. Amina was not such a monster that she wouldn't acknowledge the near impossibility of this demand. The housekeeper's tone softened a bit when she said, "The others will help, of course. But they have their regular duties to attend to as well, you understand. The bulk of the work will be yours." "Yes, ma'am." "Do this well, girl, and I will see about hiring you on permanently. But I make no promises." Mrs. Amina lifted a finger, then pointed it at Alizeh. "If you don't learn to keep that mouth shut." Alizeh took a sharp breath and nodded. 7. Kamran had only just entered the antechamber leading to his grandfather's rooms when he felt it. A breath of movement. There was a glimmer of unnaturally refracted light along the walls, a hint of perfume in the air. Kamran purposely slowed his stride, for he knew his predator would not resist such an easy mark. There. A flutter of skirts. Not a moment too soon, Kamran had clamped a hand over his assailant's fist, her fingers clenched around the hilt of a ruby dagger, which she held happily at his throat.
"I tire of this game, mother."
She twisted out of reach and laughed, her dark eyes gleaming.
"Oh, darling, I never do."
Kamran watched his mother with an impassive expression. She was so covered in jewels, she glittered even standing still.
"You find it diverting," he said, "to play at murdering your own child?"
She laughed again and spun around him, velvet skirts shimmering. Her Royal Highness, Firuzeh, the Princess of Ardunia, was imperial in her beauty, but then this was not such an extraordinary accomplishment for a princess. Loveliness was to be expected of any royal who aspired to the throne, and it was no secret that Firuzeh resented the untimely death of her husband, who 7 years ago had lost his head in a senseless battle and had left her forever a princess, never a queen. "I am tragically bored," she said, "and as my child pays so little attention to me, I am forced to be creative." Kamran was freshly bathed, his clothes pressed and scented, but he wanted desperately to be back in his military uniform. He'd always disliked his formal clothes for their impracticality, their frivolousness. He resisted the urge now to scratch his neck, where the stiff collar of his tunic scraped against his throat.
"No doubt there are innumerable other ways," he said to his mother, "to inspire my attention."
"Tedious other ways," she said tersely. "Besides, I should not have to inspire your interest. I did enough work growing you inside my own body. I am owed, at the very least, a modicum of devotion." Kamran bowed.
"Indeed."
"You patronize me."
"I do not."
Firuzeh slapped Kamran's hand away from his neck. "Do cease scratching yourself like a dog, my love." Kamran stiffened. It did not matter how many men he'd killed, his mother would forever treat him like a child.
"You would blame me for my discomfort, when the collar of this ridiculous costume clearly seeks the decapitation of its wearer? Pray, can we not, in all the empire, find someone to stitch together 2 pieces of reasonable clothing?"
Firuzeh ignored this. She said, "It is a dangerous thing to keep an intelligent woman from performing a single practical task," and slipped her arm through her son's, forcing them to walk together toward the king's main chamber. "I am not to blame for my fits of creativity." Kamran stopped, surprised, and turned to his mother.
"Do you mean to say you have a desire to work?"
Firuzeh made a face. "Don't be intentionally stupid. You know what I mean." Kamran had once thought there could never in all the world exist his mother's equal, not in beauty or elegance, not in grace or intelligence. He'd not known then how critical it was to also possess a heart.
"No," he said. "I'm afraid I haven't the slightest idea."
Firuzeh sighed theatrically, waving him away as they entered the king's reception chamber. Kamran had not known his mother would be joining them for this meeting. He suspected that more than anything else, she'd come along merely for another look at the king's rooms, as his were her favourite in the palace, and seldom was anyone invited inside. His grandfather's rooms were designed entirely with mirrors, with what seemed an incalculable number of these small reflective tiles. Every inch of the interior space, high and low, glittered with arrangements of star-like patterns, all interwoven into a series of larger geometric shapes. The soaring domed ceilings glimmered from high above, a mirage of infinity that seemed to reach the heavens. 2 large windows were thrown open to grant entree to the sun. Sharp shafts of light penetrated the room, further illuminating constellation after constellation of shattered glow. Even the floors were covered in mirrored tiles, though the delicate work was protected by a series of rich, intricately woven rugs. The overall effect was ethereal. Kamran imagined it was not unlike standing in the belly of a star. The room itself was sublime, but the effect it had on its occupants was perhaps the greater accomplishment. A visitor stepped into this room and felt at once exalted, transported to the heavens. Even Kamran was not immune to its effects. His mother, however, grew mournful. "Oh, my dear," she said, spinning around the room, a hand clasped to her chest. "This should have all been mine one day." Kamran watched as his mother peered into the nearest wall, admiring herself. She fluttered her fingers, making her jewels sparkle and dance. Kamran always found it a bit disorienting, entering this space. It inspired a feeling of magnificence, yes, but he found the feeling chased always by a feeling of inadequacy. He felt his small footprint in the world never more acutely than when surrounded by true strength, and he never felt this feeling with more precision than when he drew nearer his grandfather. The prince looked around then for a sign of the man. Kamran peered through a crack in one of the adjoining doors, the one he knew led to the king's bedchamber, and was weighing the impertinence of searching the bedchamber when Firuza tugged on his arm. Kamran looked back. "Life is so unfair, is it not?" she said, her eyes shining with feeling. "Our dreams so easily shattered?" A muscle jumped in Kamran's jaw. "Indeed, mother. Father's death was a great tragedy." She made a non-committal noise. Often, Kamran thought he could not leave this palace quickly enough. He did not resent his inheritance to the throne, but neither did he relish it. No, Kamran knew too well the gore that accompanied glory. He'd never once hoped to be king. As a child, people spoke to Kamran of his position as if he were blessed, fortunate to be in line for a title that first demanded the deaths of the 2 people he cared for most in the world. It had always seemed to him a disturbing business, and never more so than the day his father's head had been returned home without its body. Kamran was 11 years old. He was expected to show strength even then. Only days later, he was forced to attend a ceremony declaring him the direct heir to the throne. He was but a child, commanded to stand beside the mutilated remains of his father and show no pain, no fear, only fury. It was the day his grandfather gave him his first sword, the day his life changed forever. It was the day a boy was forced to leap, unformed, into the body of a man. Kamran closed his eyes, felt the press of a cold blade against his cheek. "Lost in your head, darling?" He looked at his mother, irritated not merely with her, but with himself. Kamran did not know the precise shape of the discomfort that addled him. He could not fathom an explanation for his disordered thoughts. He only knew he felt every day a creeping dread, and worse. He feared such uncertainty of mind would only exacerbate matters. For these lost moments, Kamran knew, could cost him his life. His mother had proven that just now. She seemed to read his mind. "Don't worry. It's decorative. Mostly." Firuza stepped back, tapping the glimmering ruby blade with the tip of a perfectly rounded fingernail. She tucked the weapon into her robes. "But I am quite angry with you today, and we must speak about it quickly."
"Why is that?"
"Because your grandfather has things he wishes to say to you, but I mean to say my things first."
"No, Mother. I meant, why are you angry?"
"Well, certainly we must discuss this servant girl you have
"There you are!"
boomed a voice just behind them, and Kamran spun around to see the king approach, transcendent in vibrant shades of green. Firuza fell into a deep curtsy. Kamran bowed.
"Come, come,"
the king motioned with one hand.
"Let me look at you."
Kamran stood and stepped forward. The king took Kamran's hands and held them, his warm eyes appraising the prince with an undisguised curiosity. Kamran understood that he would be reprimanded for his actions today, but he also knew he would bear the repercussions with dignity. There was no one alive he respected more than his grandfather, and Kamran would honor the king's wishes, whatever they were. King Zal was a living legend. His grandfather, his father's father, had overcome all manner of tribulations. When Zal was born, his mother had thought she'd given birth to an old man, for the baby's hair was already white, his eyelashes white, his skin so pale it was nearly translucent. Despite the protests of the diviners, the child had been declared cursed, and his horrified father refused to own him. The wretched king ripped the newborn child from his mother's arms and carried him to the peak of the highest mountain, where the infant was left to die. Zal's salvation came in the form of a majestic bird that discovered the crying infant and carried it away, raising it as one of its own. Zal's eventual return to claim his rightful place as heir and king was one of the greatest stories of their time, and his long reign over Ardunia had been just and merciful. Of his many achievements, Zal was the only Ardunian king who'd seen fit to put an end to the violence between Jinn and clay. It was by his order that the controversial fire accords had been established. Ardunia was, as a result, one of the only empires living in peace with Jinn, and for that alone Kamran knew his grandfather would not be forgotten. Finally the king drew away from his grandson.
"Your choices today were exceedingly curious,"
Zal said, as he seated himself on his mirrored throne, the sole piece of furniture in the room. Kamran and his mother did what was expected and folded themselves onto the floor cushions before him.
"Do you not agree?"
Kamran did not immediately respond. "I think we can all agree that the prince's behavior was both hasty and unbecoming," his mother interjected. "He must make amends."
"Indeed?"
Zal turned his clear brown eyes on his daughter-in-law.
"What kind of amends do you recommend, my dear?"
Firuza faltered. "I cannot think of any at present, Your Majesty, but I am certain we shall think of something." Zal steepled his hands under his chin, against the carefully trimmed cloud of his beard. To Kamran he said,
"You neither deny nor justify your actions today?"
"I do not."
"And yet I see that you are not remorseful."
"I am not." Zal turned the full force of his gaze upon his grandson.
"You will, of course, tell me why."
"With all due respect, Your Majesty, I do not think it unbecoming of a prince to care for the welfare of his people." The king laughed.
"No, I dare say it is not. What is unbecoming is a fickleness of character, and an unwillingness to speak the truth to those who know you best."
Kamran stiffened, heat prickling along the nape of his neck. He knew a rebuke when he heard one, and he was not yet immune to the effects of an admonishment from his grandfather.
"Your Highness, you have walked among your people for some time now, Kamran. You've seen all manner of suffering. I might accept an explanation of idealism more readily were your actions symptomatic of a larger philosophical position, which we both know they are not, as you've never before taken an active interest in the lives of street children, or servants, for that matter. Certainly there is more to this story than the sudden expansion of your heart." A pause. "Do you deny that you acted out of character? That you put yourself in danger?"
"I will not attempt to deny the first. As to the second—"
"You were alone, unarmed. You are heir to an empire that spans a third of the known world. You solicited the help of passers-by, put yourself at the mercy of strangers."
"I had my swords."
Zal smiled. "You persist in insulting me with these ill-considered protests. I mean no disrespect, and yet you are aware, are you not, that a man in possession of a sword is not invincible, that he might be attacked from above, that he might be slain by arrow, that he might be mobbed or overrun, that he might be knocked on the head and dragged away for ransom?"
Kamran bowed his head.
"Yes, Your Majesty." "Then you accept that you acted out of character, that you put yourself in danger?"
"Yes, Your Majesty."
"Very good. I am asking now only for your explanation."
Kamran took a deep breath and exhaled slowly through his nose. He considered telling the king what he'd told Hassan, that he'd involved himself in the situation because the girl had appeared to him conspicuous, untrustworthy. And yet Hassan had all but laughed at his explanation, at his instinct that something was amiss. How might Kamran forge into words the influence of an intuition invisible to the eye? Indeed, the more he deliberated, the more the prince's justifications, which had earlier struck him as cogent, seemed now, under the searing gaze of his grandfather, as scattered as sand. Quietly, Kamran said, "I have no explanation, Your Majesty." The king hesitated at that, the smile evaporating from his eyes.
"You cannot mean it."
"I beg you will forgive me."
"What of the girl? I would not judge you too harshly if you admitted to some weakness of the mind there. Perhaps you will tell me she was a disorienting beauty, that you interfered for some lesser sordid reason, that you fancy yourself in love with her."
"I did not." Kamran's jaw tensed.
"I do not. I most certainly would not." "Kamran."
"Grandfather, I could not even see her face. You could not expect me to own such a lie." For the first time, the king grew visibly concerned.
"My child, do you not understand how precarious your position is? How many would celebrate any excuse to have your faculties examined? Those who covet your position would invite any reason to deem you unworthy of the throne. It disturbs me more to know that your actions were born not of recklessness, but thoughtlessness. Stupidity is possibly your worst offense."
Kamran flinched. True, he deeply respected his grandfather, but so too did the prince respect himself, and his pride would no longer allow him to endure an onslaught of insults without protest. He lifted his head, looking the king directly in the eye when he said, with some sharpness,
"I believe the girl might be a spy."
King Zal visibly straightened, his countenance revealing nothing of the tension visible in his hands, clenched now around the arms of his throne. He was silent for so long that Kamran feared in the interlude he'd made a terrible mistake. The king said only,
"You thought the girl a spy?" "Yes. It is the single true thing you have spoken."
Instantly, Kamran was disarmed. He stared at the king then, bewildered.
"I may now understand your motivations," said his grandfather, "but I am yet to comprehend your lack of discretion. You thought it wise to pursue such a suspicion in the middle of the street. You thought the girl a spy, so you say. And what of the boy? Did you think him a saint? That you carried him through the square, allowing him to bleed all over your body?"
For the second time, Kamran experienced an unnerving heat inflame his skin. Again he lowered his eyes.
"No, Your Majesty.
There I had not been thinking clearly."
"Kamran, you are to be king,"
said his grandfather, who sounded suddenly close to anger.
"You have no choice but to think clearly. The people may discuss all manner of gossip pertaining to their sovereign, but the soundness of his mind should never be a topic of discussion."
Kamran kept his head bowed, his eyes trained on the intricate repeating patterns of the rug underfoot.
"Do we need worry what anyone thinks of my mind? Surely there's no need to concern ourselves with such matters at this juncture. You are strong and healthy, grandfather. You will rule our dunya for many years yet."
Zal laughed out loud, and Kamran looked up.
"Oh, your sincerity does move me, truly. But my sojourn here is coming to an end," he said, his eyes searching for the window. "I have felt it for some time now. Grandfather,"
King Zal held up a hand,
"I will not be distracted from our present discussion. Neither will I insult your intelligence by reminding you how profoundly your every action affects the Empire. A simple announcement of your return home would have been enough to stir up all manner of theatre and excitement. But your actions today—"
"Indeed," said his mother, interjecting herself, reminding everyone she was still there. "Kamran, you should be ashamed of yourself, acting the part of a commoner."
"Ashamed?"
Zal looked at his daughter-in-law in surprise. To Kamran he said,
"Is that why you think I've summoned you?"
Kamran hesitated.
"I expected you might be angry with me, yes, Your Majesty. I was also told you might expect me to host a ball, now that I've inadvertently announced my return."
Zal sighed, his white brows knitting together.
"Hassan told you that, I imagine?"
The king's frown grew deeper.
"A ball. Yes, a ball. Though that is the least of it."
Kamran tensed.
"Your Highness?" "Oh, my child."
Zal shook his head.
"I see only now that you do not realize what you've done."
Firuza looked from her son to the king and back again. "What has he done?"
"It was not your mere interference that caused such talk today,"
Zal said softly. He was staring out the window again.
"Had you left the boy to die in his own blood, it would have been little remarked upon. These things occasionally happen. You could have quietly summoned the magistrates, and the boy would have been carted away. Instead, you held him in your arms. You let the blood of a street orphan touch your skin, sully your clothes. You showed care and compassion for one of their own." "And am I to be punished, Your Majesty? Am I to be cut down for a display of mercy?" Kamran said, even as he felt the ascent of an unsettling apprehension. "I thought it expected of a prince to be in service of his people." His grandfather almost smiled. "Do you mean to purposely misunderstand me? Your life is too valuable, Kamran, You, heir to the largest empire on earth, recklessly exposed yourself to danger. Your performance today might go unquestioned by the people, but it will be severely scrutinized by the nobles, who will wonder whether you've gone mad." "Gone mad?" the prince said, struggling now to control his anger. "Is that not a gross overreaction? When there were no repercussions? When I did nothing but assist a dying boy?" "You did nothing but cause a riot. They are only chanting your name in the streets."
Firuza gasped and ran to the window, as if she might see or hear anything from within the palace walls, which were notoriously impenetrable. The prince, who knew better than to hope for a glimpse of a mob, sank back down. He was stunned. Zal sat forward in his seat.
"I know in your heart you would fight to the death for your empire, child. But this is not at all the same kind of sacrifice. A crown prince does not risk his life in the town square for a thieving street urchin. It is not done."
"No," said the prince, subdued. He felt suddenly leaden. "I expect it is not."
"We must now temper your recklessness with displays of solemnity," said his grandfather. "Such performances will be for the benefit in particular of the noble families of the 7 houses, upon whose political influence we heavily rely. You will host a ball. You will be seen at court. You will pay your respects to the 7 houses, House of Pir in particular. You will relieve them of any fears they might have as concerns your character. I will have them question neither the soundness of your mind nor your ability to rule. Is that clear?"
"Yes, Your Majesty," said the prince, discomposed. Only now was he beginning to understand the weight of his error. "I will do as you bid me, and I will remain in Setor for as long as you think it necessary to repair this damage. Then, if you will allow it, I'd like to return to my troops." Briefly, Zal smiled.
"I'm afraid it is no longer a good idea for you to be far from home."
Kamran did not pretend to misunderstand. "You are healthy," he said, with more heat than he intended. "Fit and strong, of sound mind. You could not be certain of such a thing."
"When you get to be my age,"
Zal said gently,
"you can indeed be certain of such things. I've grown weary of this world, Kamran. My soul is eager to depart, but I cannot leave without first ensuring that our line is protected, that our empire will be protected."
Slowly the prince looked up into his grandfather's eyes.
"You must know," Zal smiled. "I did not ask you to come home merely to rest."
At first, Kamran did not understand. When he did, a beat later, he felt the force of the realization like a blow to the head. He could scarcely form the words when he said, "You need me to marry."
"Our dunya requires an heir."
"I am your heir, Your Majesty. I am your servant."
"Kamran, we are on the brink of war."
The prince held steady even as his heart pounded. He stared at his grandfather in something akin to disbelief. This was the conversation he'd been waiting to have, the news he'd been waiting to discuss. Yet even now, King Zal seemed disinclined to say much. This Kamran could not countenance. His grandfather was threatening to die, threatening to leave him here alone to wage a war to defend their empire, and instead of equipping him for such a fate, was tasking him with marriage? No, he could not believe it. Through sheer force of will was Kamran able to keep his voice steady when he said,
If we are to go to war, Your Highness, surely you might assign me a more practical task? There's no doubt a great deal more I could do to protect our empire at such a time than court some nobleman's daughter."
The king only stared at Kamran, his expression serene.
"In my absence, the greatest gift you could give your empire is assurance, certainty. War will come, and with it your duty," he held up a hand to prevent Kamran from speaking, "which I know you do not fear. But if something should happen to you on the battlefield, we will be in chaos. Worthless relations will claim the throne and then lay waste to it. There are 500,000 soldiers under our command, tens of millions who rely on us to manage their well-being, to ensure their safety, to procure the necessary water for their crops, to guarantee food for their children."
Zal leaned forward.
"You must secure the line, my child. Not just for me, but for your father, for your legacy. This, Kamran, is what you must do for your empire."
The prince understood then that there was no choice to be made. King Zal was not asking a question. He was issuing a command. Kamran rose on one knee, bowed his head before his king.
"Upon my honor," he said quietly, "you have my word."
8. This day had been more difficult than most. Alizeh had boiled water until the steam seared her skin. She'd plunged her hands into soapy, scalding hot liquid so many times that the grooves in her knuckles had split. Her fingers were blistered, warm to the touch. The sharp edges of her floor brush had dug into her palms, rubbing the skin raw until it bled. She'd bunched her apron in her fists as often as she dared, but every desperate search for her handkerchief turned up only disappointment. Alizeh had little time to dwell on the many thoughts haunting her mind that day, though neither did she desire to think upon such disheartening matters. Between the devil's visit, the terrifying appearance of the hooded stranger, the cruelty of Miss Huda, and the boys she'd left broken in the snow, Alizeh did not lack for fuel to feed her fears. She considered, as she scrubbed clean yet another latrine, that it was probably for the best that she ignore the lot. Better not to think on any of it. Better to simply push every day through the pain and the fear, until she, too, was finally consumed by eternal darkness. It was a bleak thought for a young woman of 18, but she thought it nonetheless. That perhaps only in death might she find the freedom she so desperately sought, for she had long ago given up hope of finding solace in this world. Indeed, most hours of the day, Alizeh could hardly believe who she'd become, how far she'd strayed from the plans once held for her future. Long ago there'd been a blueprint for her life, a quiet infrastructure designed to support who she might one day be. She'd been left little choice but to abandon that imagined future, not unlike a child shedding an imagined friend. All that remained of her old existence was the familiar whisper of the devil, his voice growing under her skin at intervals, snuffing her life of light. Would that he, too, might vanish. The clock had just struck 2, when for the 12th time that day, Alizeh placed her empty buckets on the kitchen floor. She looked around for any sign of cook or Mrs. Amina before stealing to the back of the room, and only when she was certain of her solitude did she do what she'd already done 11 times before and wrench open the heavy wooden door. Alizeh was struck straight away by the intoxicating smell of rose water. The Wintrose Festival was one of the few things familiar to her in this foreign royal city, for the Wintrose season was celebrated all throughout the empire of Ardunia. Alizeh had fond memories of harvesting the delicate pink blooms with her parents, straw baskets colliding as they walked, heads dense with perfume. She smiled. Nostalgia nudged her feet across the threshold, sense memory encouraging her legs, articulating her limbs. A zephyr moved through the alley, tumbling rose petals toward her, and she drew the heady floral fragrance deep into her lungs, experiencing a rare moment of unqualified joy as the breeze ruffled her hair, the hems of her skirts. The sun was but a nebulous glow through an exhalation of clouds, painting the moment in diffuse golden light that made Alizeh feel as if she'd stepped into a dream. She could hardly help her need to draw nearer to such beauty. One at a time, she began picking the wind-scattered roses out of the snow, gently tucking the wilting blossoms into the pockets of her apron. These Gol Mohammadi roses were so heavily scented, their perfume would last for months. Her mother had always used theirs to make a rose-petal jam, saving a few corollas to press between the pages of a book, which Alizeh liked to... Without warning, her heart began to race. It was that familiar pinch in her chest, her pulse pounding in her bleeding palms. Her hands shook without warning, petals falling loose from her fists. Alizeh was struck with a frightening need to run from this place, to strip the apron from her body and tear across the city, lungs blazing. She wanted desperately to return home, to fall at her parents' feet and grow roots there at the base of their bodies. She felt all this in the span of a second, the feeling flooding her with a riotous force and leaving her, in its wake, strangely numb. It was a humbling experience, for Alizeh was again reminded that she had no home, no parents to whom she might return. It had been years since their deaths, and still it seemed to Alizeh an outrageous injustice that she could not see their faces. She swallowed. Once, Alizeh's life had meant to be a source of strength for the people she loved. Instead, she often felt her birth had exposed her parents to bloodshed, to the brutal murders that would take them both, first her father, then her mother, in the same year. Jinn had been viciously slaughtered for ages, it was true. Their numbers had been decimated, their footprint reduced near to nothing, and with it, much of their legacy. The deaths of her parents, too, had seemed to the unsuspecting eye much like the deaths of countless other Jinn, random acts of hatred, or even unfortunate accidents. And yet, Alizeh was plagued always by an unsettling suspicion that her parents' deaths had not been random. Despite their diligent efforts to keep Alizeh's experience concealed, she worried, for it was not only her parents, but all those whose lives had once touched hers, who'd vanished in a series of similar tragedies. Alizeh could not help but wonder whether the true target of all this violence had been someone else entirely. Her. With no proof to corroborate such a theory, Alizeh's mind was unable to rest, devoured every day a bit more by the voracious appetite of her fears. Heart still thudding in her chest, she retreated inside. Alizeh had searched the back alley beyond the kitchen each of the 12 times she'd come downstairs, but the Fesht boy had never turned up, and she couldn't understand why. She'd scavenged from the remains of breakfast a few chunks of pumpkin bread, which she'd carefully wrapped in wax paper, and hid the rations under a loose floorboard in the pantry. The boy had seemed so hungry this morning that Alizeh could not imagine an explanation for his absence, not unless... She added firewood to the stove, and hesitated. It was possible she'd hurt the boy too badly during their scuffle. Sometimes Alizeh did not know her own strength. She checked the kettles she'd set to boil, then glanced at the kitchen clock. There were still many hours left in the day, and she worried her hands wouldn't survive the onslaught. Sacrifices would have to be made. Alizeh sighed. Quickly she tore 2 strips of fabric from the hem of her apron. Alizeh, who made all her own clothes, quietly mourned the ruin of the piece, and then bandaged her wounds as best she could, with blistered fingers. She would need to find time to visit the apothecary tomorrow. She had some coin now. She could afford to purchase salve, and maybe even a poultice. Her hands, she hoped, would recover. Having wrapped her wounds, the sharp edge of her torment began slowly to abate, the modicum of relief unbolting the vice from around her chest. In the aftermath, she took a deep, bracing breath, experiencing a prickle of embarrassment at her own thoughts, at the dark turns they took with so little encouragement. Alizeh did not want to lose faith in this world. It was only that every pain she owned seemed to extract hope from her as payment. Still, she considered, as she refilled her buckets with freshly boiled water, her parents would have wanted more for her. They would have wanted her to keep fighting. One day, her father had said, "This world will bow to you." Just then came a sharp knock at the back door. Alizeh straightened so quickly she nearly dropped the kettle. She tossed another glance around the unusually empty kitchen. There was so much work to be done today that the servants were granted no breaks, and snatched the hidden parcel from the pantry. Carefully she opened the door. Alizeh blinked, then stepped back. It was Mrs. Sana staring at her, the bespectacled housekeeper from the Lausanne ambassador's estate. Stunned as she was, Alizeh nearly forgot to curtsy. Housekeepers, who ruled their own little kingdoms, were not considered servants and did not wear snodders. As a result, they were due a level of respect that Alizeh was still learning. She bobbed a curtsy, then straightened. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How may I help you?" Mrs. Sana said nothing, only held out a small purse, which Alizeh accepted in her injured hand. She felt the weight of the coin at once. "Oh," she breathed. "Miss Huda was very pleased with the dress, and would like to engage your services again." Alizeh went suddenly solid. She dared not speak, dared not move for fear of ruining the moment. She tried to remember if she'd fallen asleep, if perhaps she was dreaming. Mrs. Sana rapped her knuckles on the doorframe. "You've gone deaf, girl?" Alizeh took a sharp breath. "No, ma'am," she said quickly. "That is, yes, ma'am, it would be my honor." Mrs. Sana sniffed at her in a way that was becoming familiar. "Yes, I dare say it would be, and you'll remember it the next time you speak ill of my mistress. She meant to send her maid, but I insisted on delivering the message myself. You understand my meaning." Alizeh lowered her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "Miss Huda will need at least 4 gowns for the upcoming festivities and 1 showpiece for the ball." Alizeh's head snapped up. She did not know to which upcoming festivities Mrs. Sana was referring, and she did not care. "Miss Huda wants 5 gowns?" "Will that be a problem?" Alizeh heard a roar in her ears, experienced a terrifying disorientation. She worried she might cry, and she did not think she'd forgive herself if she did. "No, ma'am," she managed to say. "No problem at all." "Good. You may come to the house tomorrow at 9 in the evening." A heavy pause. "After you finish your shift here." "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you for 9 o'clock sharp, you understand?" And Mrs. Sana was gone, the door slamming shut behind her. Alizeh could hold it in no longer. She slid to the floor and sobbed. 9. In the milky eye of the moon, The silhouettes of passers-by merged into one gelatinous mass, rumbling with sound. Raucous cries rang out, laughter tearing through the trees, lamplight flickering as people stumbled through the streets. The night was pure madness. Alizeh suppressed a shudder. It disturbed her always to be enveloped by the dark, for it brought to life a fear of blindness she could not fully rationalize. Her ancestors had once been sentenced to an existence without light or heat. She knew this, yes, but that she should carry the fear still struck her as most peculiar. Worse, it seemed her strange fate to be tethered always to the dark, for these days she moved most freely through the world only in the absence of daylight, when the yoke of duty had been removed. Alizeh had emerged from Ba's house long after the sun had been extinguished, and though the good news of more work for Miss Huda had done a great deal to buoy her spirits, Alizeh was burdened anew by the state of her hands. The day's tasks had torn fresh wounds into her already split palms, and the strips of fabric she'd carefully wrapped around her injuries had grown damp and heavy with blood. Alizeh, who now needed to create 5 gowns in addition to performing her regular duties, suddenly required her hands more than ever, which meant her journey to the apothecary could not wait until tomorrow. It was on aching feet that Alizeh dredged through the evening's snowfall, arms tight against her chest, chin tucked into her collar. Frost grew steadily along the wet tendrils of her hair, unruly strands whipping in the wind as she went. Already Alizeh had paid a visit to the local hammam, where she'd washed the day's filth from her body. She always felt better when she was clean, and though the task had cost her physically, she felt it ultimately worthwhile. More, the night air was bracing, and the cold shock to her uncovered head kept her thoughts focused. Alizeh required a sharpness of mind never more than when she walked the streets at night, for she knew well the dangers posed by desperate strangers in the dark. She was careful to remain quiet as she moved, keeping to the light and to herself. Still, it was impossible to ignore the uproar. People were chanting in the streets, some singing, some yelling, all too drunk to be understood. There were large crowds dancing, all of them working together to hold aloft what appeared to be a scarecrow, the straw figure wearing a crude iron crown. Masses of people were sitting in the middle of the road, smoking shisha and drinking tea, refusing to clear the streets, even as horses whinnied, carriages teetered, and noblemen emerged from the plush interiors of their conveyances, shouting and brandishing whips. Alizeh walked through a cloud of apricot-flavoured smoke, shook off an evening peddler, and pushed through a narrow gap in a group laughing uproariously at the story of a child who'd caught a snake in its hands and, delighted, had dipped the serpent's head over and over again into a bowl of yogurt. Privately, Alizeh smiled. Some people, she noticed, were carrying signs, some held high, others dragging behind like a dog on a leash. She tried to make out the printed words, but none could be deciphered in the dim, flickering light. One thing was for certain. This was an unusual level of merriment and madness, even for the royal city, and for a moment Alizeh's curiosity threatened to overcome her better senses. She tamped it down. Strangers jostled her, a few swiping at her snudder, laughing in her face, stepping on her skirts. She'd learned long ago that servants of her station were the most universally despised, considered fair game for all manner of cruelty. Others in her position were eager to remove their snudders in public spaces for fear of drawing unwanted attention. But Alizeh could not remove her snudder without great risk to herself. Though she felt certain she was being hunted, she did not know by whom, which meant she could never let down her guard. Alizeh's face was, unfortunately, too easily remembered. Hers was the rare exception. It was otherwise difficult to spot the difference between Jinn and clay, as Jinn had thousands of years ago regained not only their vision, but the varying levels of melanin in their hair and skin. Alizeh, like many in our dunya, had yards of glossy coal-black curls and an olive complexion. But her eyes... She did not know the colour of her eyes. Occasionally they took on the familiar brown of burnt umber, which she believed to be the natural colour of her irises, but more often her eyes were a piercing shade of ice blue, so light they were hardly a colour at all. It was no wonder then that Alizeh lived always with a perpetual chill, one she felt even in the sockets of her eyes. Ice sluiced through her clear veins, even in the pit of summer, immobilizing her in the way she imagined only her ancestors could understand, for it was from them that she'd inherited this irregularity. The resulting effect was so disorienting, few could bear to look at the girl. And yet, Alizeh's face might have been more readily ignored had her irises only ceased to change shades, which they had not. Instead, they flickered, alternating colour constantly. It was a problem over which she had no control, whose provocation she did not understand. Alizeh felt a touch of moisture on her lips then, and looked up. Fresh snow had begun to fall. She pulled her arms tighter across her chest and darted down a familiar road, her head bowed against the wind. She'd been growing slowly aware of a pair of footsteps behind her, unusual only in their consistency, and felt a frisson of fear, which she forcefully dismissed. Alizeh felt she was growing too easily paranoid of late, and besides, the glow of the apothecary's shop was just up ahead. She sprinted toward it now. A bell chimed as she pushed open the wooden door, and she was nearly shoved right back out by the crowd jammed within. The apothecary was unusually busy for the hour, and Alizeh could not help but notice that its standard aroma of sage and saffron had been exchanged for the mephitic vapours of unwashed latrines and aged vomit. Alizeh held her breath as she took her place in line, resisting the urge to stamp the snow from her boots on the rug underfoot. Present clientele were shouting obscenities at each other, jostling for space while cradling fractured arms and broken noses. Some were dripping red blood from the crowns of their heads, their mouths. One man was presenting a child with the bloody tooth he'd plucked from his head, a souvenir from another who'd thought to bite his skull. Alizeh could scarcely believe it. These people needed baths and surgeons, not an apothecarist. She could only imagine they were either too stupid or too drunk to know better than to seek aid here.
"All right! Enough!" boomed an angry voice over the crowd. "The lot of you! Get out! Out of my shop before you—"
There was the abrupt sound of glass shattering, vials knocking to the ground. The same booming voice shouted renewed epithets as the crowd grew only more agitated, and there was a veritable stampede for the door when he brandished a cane and threatened not only to horsewhip the group of them, but to turn them over to the magistrates on charges of public indecency. Alizeh flattened herself as best she could against the wall, so successful in her aim that when the horde had finally cleared, the shopkeeper almost missed her. Almost.
"Get out!"
he barked, advancing on her.
"Get out of my store! Out, you heathen!"
"Sir, please." Alizeh shrank back. "I'm here only for some salve and bandages. I'd be terribly grateful for your help." The shopkeeper froze, the angry expression still etched onto his face. He was a narrow man, tall and wiry, with dark brown skin and coarse black hair, and he very nearly sniffed her. His assessing eyes took in her patched, but clean, jacket, the tidiness of her hair. Finally he took a deep, steadying breath and stepped away.
"All right, then. What'll it be?"
He moved back around the main counter, staring down at her with large, ink-dark eyes.
"Where's the damage?"
Alizeh clenched her fists, stuffed them in her pockets, and tried to smile. Her mouth was the only part of her face unobscured, and it was, as a result, a point of focus for most people. The apothecarist, however, seemed determined to stare at her eyes, or where he thought her eyes might be. For a moment, Alizeh was unsure what to do. It was true that from the outside, Jinn were mostly undetectable. It was in fact their stunning physical resemblance to clay that had made them the biggest threat, the more difficult to suspect. The fire accords had attempted to bring organization to these sorts of problems, but under the veneer of peace, there remained always an uneasiness among the people, an ingrained hatred of their kind, of their imagined association with the devil that was not easily forgotten. Presenting strangers with clear proof of her identity had always inspired in Alizeh a halting fear, for she never knew how they might react. More often than not, people could not hide their contempt, and more often than not, she did not have the energy to face it. Quietly, she said, "I have only a few scrapes on my hands that need tending, and a few blisters. A few fresh bandages, and a salve you'd recommend, sir? I'd be most obliged." The apothecarist made a sound in his mouth, something like a drummed his fingers on the counter, and turned to study his walls. The long wooden shelves housed stoppered bottles of untold remedies.
"And what of your neck, miss? The cut there seems severe."
Unconsciously, Alizeh touched her fingers to the wound. I beg your pardon, sir?"
"You have a laceration at your throat, of which I doubt you're unaware. You must be feeling the pain at the incision, miss. The wound is likely warm to the touch, and—" he peered closer. "Yes, it looks like there's a bit of swelling. We must get ahead of any major infection."
Alizeh went suddenly rigid with fear. The Fesht boy had cut her with a crude, dirty blade. She'd seen it herself, had examined the tool in her own hand. Why had she not realized there'd be consequences? Certainly she'd been unwell and in pain all day, but she'd compartmentalized the sensations, experiencing it all as one large unpleasantness. She'd never had a chance to pinpoint the many discrete origins of her discomfort. Alizeh squeezed her eyes shut and grabbed at the counter, steadying herself. She could ill afford much of anything these days, but she could least afford to be sick. If she caught a fever, if she could not work, she would be turned out onto the street, where she'd doubtless die in the gutter. It was this cold reality that propelled her actions every day, this larger instinct that demanded she survive.
"Miss?"
Oh, the devil always did know when to pay a visit. 10. Kamran stood in the shadow of a shuttered storefront, the hood of his cloak whipping in the wind, snapping against his face like the leathery wings of a bat. The snow had softened to rain, and he listened to the drops pop along the awning overhead, watched as they pelted the white drift, frosting the streets. Long minutes passed, piles of snow perforating, then dissolving at his feet. He should not have come. After their meeting, the king had taken Kamran aside to ask further questions about the suspected servant girl, questions Kamran only too gladly answered, having felt validated by his grandfather's concern. It was in fact at the king's behest that Kamran was to continue his inquiries into the girl's whereabouts, for Zal, too, had seemed perturbed upon hearing a more detailed accounting of the morning's events. He'd dispatched the prince into town to fulfill various obligations, among them a visit to the Fesht boy, and to then surveil the city. Naturally, Kamran had obliged. A focused task was precisely what he needed, as it would allow him a reprieve from his own mind, from the weight of all that his grandfather had recently imparted. The prince had thought to see the mobs for himself in any case. He wanted to hear the commotion he had caused, to bear witness to the consequences of his actions. In the end, it had led to this: darkness. No, he should not have come at all. First was his visit to the street child, who'd been installed at the diviner's quarters in the royal square. The king had made it clear to Kamran that to ignore the boy now would make his earlier actions appear rash and hot-headed. Subsequent actions of care and compassion toward the boy would not only be expected, Zal had said, but anticipated, and as Kamran already owed the diviners a visit, it had not seemed too great a waste of his time. Instead, it had been infuriating. As it turned out, magic alone had saved the boy from the brink of death. This revelation, which should have been a relief, was to the prince grim news indeed, for it had been upon his perceived orders that the diviners had acted, and rarely, if ever, was magical assistance offered to any outside the imperial family. Vast though Ardunia was, magic as a substance was exceptionally rare. The unstable mineral was mined from the mountains at great risk, and as a result existed only in small precious quantities, meted out only by royal decree. Kamran's call for help had been interpreted as just that, marking yet another reason why his actions toward a thieving street urchin had been so significant and would not be easily forgotten. He sighed at the reminder. Though the boy was healing still, he'd managed to flinch when Kamran arrived in his room. The child had inched backward in his bed as best he could, scrambling out of reach of his unlikely saviour. They both knew it, knew that the scene within which they'd been trapped was a farce, that Kamran was no hero, that there existed no amity between them. Indeed, Kamran felt nothing but anger toward the boy. Through the careful dissemination of new rumours, the Crown had actively sought to distort the story of the street urchin. King Zal decided it would be more difficult to convince an audience that the prince had done good by saving a murderous child, and so had modified the tale to exclude any mention of harm done to the servant girl. This bothered Kamran far more than it ought, for privately he felt the rascal deserved neither the efforts made to spare him nor the care he received now. Carefully, Kamran had approached the boy's bed, claiming a small victory as fear flared to life in the child's eyes. From this, he gained impetus enough to hone his frustration, which gave his visit focus. If the prince was to be forced into the company of this disgraceful child, he would use the opportunity to demand answers to his innumerable questions. By the angels, he had questions. "Mavo kemem dinar shura," he'd said darkly. "First, I want to know why. Why did you beg me not to hand you over to the magistrates?" The boy shook his head. "Jevman," Kamran had said. "Answer me." Again, the boy shook his head. Kamran stood sharply, clasping his hands behind his back. "You and I both know the real reason you are here, and I will not soon forget it. I have no interest in forgiving you for your actions today, merely because you nearly died in the effort.
You would have murdered a young woman just to steal her wares.
Nick, hey Jeanne. No, sire.
And were willing to kill yourself so you would not have to stand trial, so you would not be turned over to the magistrates and pay the price for your debased actions.
Kamran's eyes flashed with barely suppressed anger.
Tell me why.
For the third time, the child shook his head.
Perhaps I will turn you over to the magistrates now. Perhaps they might be more effective at yielding results.
No, sire, the boy had said in his native tongue, his brown eyes large in his sunken face. You would not do that. Kamran's eyes widened a fraction.
How dare you?
Everyone thinks you saved my life, because you were compassionate and kind. If you threw me in the dungeon now, it would not look good for you, would it? Kamran's fists clenched, unclenched.
I did save your life, you ungrateful wretch.
Han, yes. The child almost smiled, but his eyes were strangely distant. Pet, Shura. But why? After this, I will be returned to the street, to the same life as before. Kamran felt an unwelcome pang in the region of his chest, a flicker of conscience. He was quite unaware that the edge to his voice had gone when he said, I do not understand why you would rather kill yourself than go to prison. No, you do not understand, sire. The red-headed boy would not meet his eyes. But I have seen what they do to kids like me. Being turned over to the magistrates is worse than death. Kamran straightened, then frowned.
What can you mean? How can it be worse than death? Our prisons are not so foul as that. You would be offered a daily meal at the very least.
The boy was now shaking his head hard, looking so agitated, Kamran feared he might bolt from the room.
All right, enough,
the prince said reluctantly, and sighed.
You may instead tell me what you know of the girl.
The boy froze at that, the inquiry unexpected enough to have disarmed him. Know of her? I do not know her, sire.
How then were you able to communicate with her? Do you speak much Ardans?
Very little, sire.
And yet you spoke with her.
Yes, sire. The boy blinked. She spoke Feshtun. Kamran was so surprised by this revelation, he failed to mask his expression fast enough.
But there are no servants in the royal city who speak Feshtun.
Begging your pardon, sire, but I didn't know you were acquainted with all the servants in the royal city. At that, Kamran experienced a swell of anger so large he thought it might break open his chest. It took all he had to bite out the words,
Your insolence is astonishing.
The boy grinned. Kamran resisted the urge to smother him. This red-headed Fesht boy had the uncommon ability to move Kamran to a swift, discomposing anger, an anger of the most dangerous variety. Kamran knew this, for he knew well his own weaknesses, and implored himself to diffuse what he knew to be an irrational reaction. There was no reason to scare away the child after all, not now that the boy might provide him with information he needed to hunt down the duplicitous servant girl.
I beg you will help me understand, Kamran had said flatly. You claim that a servant girl with little education, a servant girl who is likely illiterate, somehow spoke to you in Feshtun. You claim she gave you bread, which you'd—
No, sir. I said that she offered me bread. Kamran's jaw tensed. This was the second time the child had interrupted him.
I see little difference, he'd said. Gave and offered are interchangeable words.
No, sire. She told me to come to the kitchens at Bar's house if I was in need of bread. Here, Kamran experienced a moment of triumph.
Then she lied to you, said the prince. I know Bar's house, and that girl is no servant there. In fact, If it has not yet been made obvious to you, you should know. That girl was no servant at all."
The child shook his head. "You're wrong, sire."
"Impertinent, disrespectful, shameless boy."
Kamran found he no longer cared that the child had nearly died. He seemed well enough now, with the audacity of an impudent street rat, speaking to a member of the royal household with so little deference. And yet, Kamran was now shackled to him in this strange way, compelled to be kind to the precocious imp. Omid. His name was Omid. He was the son of saffron farmers in the south. His parents had been imprisoned for failing to pay taxes on a meagre harvest, and their official complaint, Kamran had since pulled the report, was that the taxes were a fixed amount instead of a percentage. Paying the fixed amount, they had insisted, would have meant starvation for their family, as the season's crop had been so small. They had appealed to the courts for leniency, but had contracted lung fever in prison and died days later, leaving the boy to fend for himself. 12, he'd said he was. 12 years old.
"You are either very brave or very stupid," Kamran had said to him, "to disagree with me so readily."
"But, sire, you didn't see her hands," Omid insisted. "And I did." Kamran had only scowled. In his haste to take his leave of the insufferable child, Kamran had forgotten yet again to pay his respects to the honourable priests and priestesses. He was instead intercepted by a halo of diviners on his way out, who'd said little, as they were wont to do, and accepted as payment but a moment of his time before they pressed a small parcel into his hands. The prince offered his many thanks, but his mind, full and disordered as it was, bade him tuck away the untitled gift, to be opened at a later date. The parcel would remain forgotten for some days in the interior pocket of Kamran's cloak. Unnerved by his conversation with Omid, the prince had gone straight from the diviner's quarters to Bar's house, the home of his distant aunt. He knew exactly where the kitchens were. He'd spent a great deal of his youth at Bar's house, sneaking below stairs for snacks after midnight. He considered going through the front doors and simply asking his aunt whether she'd employed such a servant, but he thought of his grandfather's warning that his actions were now under intense scrutiny. Kamran had many reasons for seeking out the girl, not the least of which was King Zal's confirmation that Ardunia was destined for war, but he did not think it wise to over-hastily spread word of this to the happy public. In any case, Kamran was good at waiting. He could stand in one position for hours without tiring, had been trained to practically disappear at will. It was no trouble at all to him to waste an hour standing in an alley to capture a criminal, not when his aim was to protect his empire, to spare his people the machinations of this faceless girl. Lie. True that he found her actions suspect. True, too, that she might be a Tulanian spy. But there was also a possibility that he was wrong about the girl, and his unwillingness to accept this fact should have concerned him. No, the unadulterated truth, which he was only now willing to admit, was that there was a grain more to his motivations. Something about this girl had burrowed under his skin. He couldn't shake it. She, a supposed poor lowly servant, had acted this morning with a mercy he could not understand, with a compassion that enraged him all the more for its inconstancy. The young woman had entered his empire ostensibly to do harm. Why should she have been the more benevolent actor this morning? Why should she have inspired in him a feeling of unworthiness? No, it made no sense. Years of training had taught the prince to recognize even the slightest inconsistencies in his opponents, weaknesses that could be mined and promptly manipulated. Kamran knew his own strengths, and his instincts in this instance could not be denied. He'd seen her contradictions from the moment he laid eyes on her. She was, without question, hiding something. He'd wanted to out her as the liar he knew her to be, to uncover what seemed to him one of only two possibilities, a treasonous spy or a frivolous society girl playing pretend. He had, instead, ended up here. Here, standing in the dark so long the mobs had begun to disperse, the streets littered now with the drunk sleeping bodies that dared not drag themselves home. Kamran had let the cold brace him until his bones shook, until he felt nothing but a large emptiness yawn open inside him. He did not want to be king. He did not want his grandfather to die, did not want to marry a stranger, did not want to father a child, did not want to lead an empire. This was the secret he seldom shared, even with himself, that he did not want this life. It was hard enough when his father had died, but Kamran couldn't even begin to imagine a world without his grandfather. He did not think he was good enough to lead an empire alone, and he did not know who he might rely upon instead. Sometimes he wasn't even sure he could trust Hassan. Instead, Kamran had distracted himself with his anger, had allowed his mind to focus on the irritations of the Fesht boy, the false face of a servant girl. The truth was that he'd been forced to return home against his will, and was now running from himself, from the counterintuitive burden of privilege, from the responsibilities laid upon his shoulders. In moments like these, he'd always consoled himself with the reassurance that he was at least a capable soldier, a competent leader. But today had disproven even that. For what good was a leader who could not even trust his own instincts? Kamran had been bested by this servant girl. Not only had she proven him wrong on all counts, she'd proven him worse. When she'd finally appeared in the alley behind Bar's house, he'd recognized her at once, but had the privilege now of inspecting her more closely. Right away he noticed the angry cut at her throat, and from there he followed the elegant lines of her neck, the delicate slope of her shoulders. For the second time that day, he noticed the way she carried herself, how different she seemed from other servants. There was a gracefulness even in the way she held her head, the way she drew her shoulders back, the way she'd tilted her face up at the sun. Kamran did not understand. If not a spy or society girl, she might perhaps be the fallen daughter of a gentleman, or even the bastard child of one. Such circumstances might explain her elegant carriage and knowledge of Feshtun. But for a well-educated child of a noble to have fallen this low? He thought it unlikely. The scandals in high society were most everyone's business, and such a person in his aunt's employ would doubtless have been known to him. Then again, it was hard to be certain of anything. In vain he'd fought for a better look at her face, and was given instead only a mouth to study. He'd stared at her lips for longer than he cared to admit, for reasons that were not lost on him. Kamran had arrived at the frightening realization that this girl might be beautiful, a thought so unexpected it nearly distracted him from his purpose. When she suddenly bit her lip, he drew a breath, startling himself. She seemed worried. He watched as she searched the alley, all the while clutching a small parcel to her chest. Kamran remembered what Omid had said about her hands, peered closer, and was dealt at once a powerful blow to his pride, to his fragile conscience. The girl's hands were so damaged he could see the injuries even from his distant vantage point. Her skin was painful to look at, red, blistered, raw. Without a doubt, the hands of a servant. Kamran rocked back on his heels, as this truth washed over him. He'd been so determined the girl was a liar, had so eagerly anticipated the moment her ugliness would be uncovered. Instead, he'd made a discovery about himself. He was the villain in this story, not she. Not only had the girl kept her promise to Omid, but she'd made preparations. It grew increasingly obvious that what she sought in that alley had been the street child himself. Twice in one day, this faceless girl had inspired in Kamran a shame so vast he could hardly breathe around it. She'd reached into his chest and broken something essential inside of him, managed it all without even acknowledging his existence. Was Kamran so weak as to be dismantled thus by a stranger? Was he so unworthy? Worse, how would he explain this embarrassment to his grandfather? So enthusiastically had Kamran added to the king's worries with his poorly supported suspicions, and now the prince's arrogance would prove only his own idiocy, an instability of mind that would further substantiate the king's fears for his grandson. In a single day, Kamran had made himself into a joke, and he wanted to sink into the earth. It was his single thought, repeating like a drumbeat in his head, when Hazan finally found him.